Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a forgotten chapter of American history, a story about women who survived one of the darkest decades this country has ever known, yet somehow became invisible. Picture this. It is 1933, New York City. Thousands of men stand in bread lines, their faces captured in iconic photographs that would define the Great Depression for generations to come. But here is the question nobody asked then, and few ask now: where were the women? More specifically, where were the 175,000 single women in New York City alone who had no jobs, no husbands, no safety net, and apparently no place in America's collective memory? Tonight, we are going to uncover their stories, the ones that slipped through the cracks of history. And I promise you, what you are about to discover will change the way you see this era forever. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten world together, I have a small request. If you find yourself drawn into these stories, if something I share tonight resonates with you or teaches you something new, would you consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like? But here is the thing. Only do it if you genuinely enjoy what we are exploring together. I want your support to mean something real, not just a quick click. And I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you winding down for the night in California? Maybe it is early morning where you are, and you're starting your day with a story. Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, get comfortable. Dim those lights, let the world outside fade away for a while, and let us step back in time together. The year is 1930, and America is about to change in ways nobody could have predicted. When the stock market crashed on that infamous October day in 1929, it sent shockwaves through every corner of American society. Within months, the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties evaporated like morning mist. Banks failed, factories closed, men who had supported entire families found themselves standing in soup lines, their pride crumbling alongside their bank accounts. And the whole nation watched, horrified, as unemployment skyrocketed to levels nobody had thought possible in modern America. But here is something fascinating and deeply troubling. When you look at the photographs from that era, when you read the newspaper headlines, when you study the government reports, there is one group of people conspicuously absent: single women. Not married women, mind you. Not mothers or wives struggling to feed their families. I am talking about the unmarried women, the ones living on their own, working to support themselves, trying to survive in a world that suddenly had no place for them. They called these women unattached women, and that term, unattached, tells you everything you need to know about how society viewed them. They were not attached to a man, which apparently meant they were not attached to anything that mattered. Let me paint you a picture of what unattached really meant in 1930s America. Imagine you are a 25-year-old woman named Eleanor. You're not our famous First Lady, just an ordinary Eleanor working as a secretary in Chicago. You have a small room in a boarding house that costs $7 a week. You earn about $18 a week when work is steady, which it increasingly is not. You're not married, maybe you were engaged once, but your fiancé could not afford to get married after he lost his job. Maybe you never met the right person. Maybe, and this was becoming more common, you actually preferred being independent. But here is the cruel reality. In the eyes of the government, in the structure of relief programs, in the entire social safety net that was being constructed during the New Deal, you essentially did not exist. The programs were designed around a specific assumption that every woman had a man to take care of her, a father, a husband, a brother, someone, and if you did not, well, that was seen as your personal failure, not a systemic problem. Let me share some numbers that will shock you. Between 1929 and 1939, marriage rates in America plummeted by 22%. Think about what that means. In just one decade, more than 1 in 5 expected marriages simply did not happen. Young couples who had been planning their futures together had to postpone indefinitely. Some gave up on marriage altogether. The financial burden of setting up a new household, of supporting a wife, of even affording a wedding, it became impossible for millions of Americans. And this created a crisis that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Suddenly, there were millions of women who needed to support themselves, women who had expected to be married by now, women who had been raised in a society that told them their value came from being someone's wife and mother, but instead they were on their own, adrift, invisible. Here is what makes this even more heartbreaking. These women were not lazy. They were not looking for handouts. In fact, a study done in Chicago in 1937 examined what they called unattached women on relief, women receiving government assistance. Do you know what they found? These women had tried everything. They had worked multiple jobs. They had moved to cheaper and cheaper housing until they were living in conditions you would not wish on anyone. They had skipped meals. They had sold their possessions. They had done everything society told them to do, and still, they could not make it work. And yet, when you look at the iconic imagery of the Great Depression, where are they? You see men in fedoras standing in unemployment lines. You see families, mothers, fathers, children displaced by the Dust Bowl. You see the famous migrant mother photograph, which has become the face of Depression-era suffering. But single women, they are ghosts in the historical record. There is a reason for this invisibility, and it is not an accident. Historians have noted something telling. There are countless photographs of single men waiting in soup kitchens, at employment offices, at relief agencies, but there are almost no equivalent images of single women in these places. Why? Because many single women struggled in secret. Some were too ashamed to seek help publicly. Others tried to seek help and were turned away because the programs were not designed for them. Still others simply disappeared into the cracks of society, becoming invisible by necessity. Think about the psychology of this for a moment. If you were a single woman in 1933 and you lost your job, where could you turn? Your family might be struggling just as much as you were. Friends might not be able to help, and if you went to a relief agency, they would ask about your husband, about your father, about any man who might be responsible for you, and when you said there was no one, you were often met with suspicion. Why was there no one? What was wrong with you? The stigma was crushing. Society had very clear expectations for women, and living independently unmarried, without male protection, that was not part of the script. These women represented something that made people uncomfortable. They were living outside the traditional family structure. And in a time of crisis, when everyone was clinging to traditional values as a source of stability, these women were seen as anomalies at best, and moral failures at worst. Let me tell you about a specific case that illuminates this perfectly. In New York City in 1933, a group of single unemployed women did something radical. They organized. They formed the Association of Unemployed Single Women, backed by the Socialist Party, and they did something that was almost unheard of. They protested publicly. They demanded jobs, housing and relief for the nearly 175,000 single unemployed women in the city. Can you imagine the courage that took? To stand up publicly and say, "We exist, we matter, we deserve help." In a society that viewed single women as either temporary states before marriage or personal failures, to organize and demand recognition was revolutionary. And here is the amazing part. They actually won a small victory. In the winter of 1933 to 1934, New York City reversed its policy and began offering aid to single women. Not much aid, and not to all of them, but it was something. It was recognition that they existed. But for every woman who joined that association, there were thousands more who suffered in silence. Women who were too proud to admit they needed help. Women who were afraid that seeking assistance would mark them as failures. Women who had internalized society's message that if they were not married, if they did not have a man to support them, then their struggles were somehow their own fault. And here is something that should make us all uncomfortable. This was not just about economics. This was about fundamental questions of who deserves help, who deserves dignity, who even deserves to be seen. The entire structure of the New Deal, which we often celebrate as this great progressive moment in American history, was built on the assumption of the male breadwinner. Programs were designed to give men jobs so they could support their families. The women in those families would be taken care of indirectly through their connection to men. But what about the women with no connection to men? What about women who were widowed and had no sons? What about women whose fathers had died or lost everything? What about women who, for whatever reason, were on their own? The system had no category for them. They fell through the cracks. Not because the system failed, but because the system was never designed to catch them in the first place. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Imagine being invisible not because people could not see you, but because the entire structure of society was built as if you did not or should not exist. Every policy, every program, every safety net assumed you were attached to a man. And if you were not, well, that was your problem to solve. This invisibility had real consequences. Women went hungry but did not appear in breadlines. Women lost their homes but did not show up in homeless statistics the same way men did. Women suffered, but they suffered quietly, out of sight, in ways that history has largely forgotten. Until now. As we continue this journey together, I want you to remember these women. Remember Eleanor, our imaginary secretary, and the hundreds of thousands of real women she represents. Because their story is not just about the past, it is about how society decides who matters, who deserves help, and who gets written out of history. And those are questions that still resonate today. But here is the thing that I find most remarkable about these women. They survived. Against incredible odds, with virtually no support, facing stigma and invisibility, they found ways to keep going. And in the next part of our story, we're going to discover something surprising, something that challenges everything we thought we knew about women and work during the Great Depression. Because while men were losing their jobs by the millions, something unusual was happening to women's employment, something that defied all expectations and created a paradox that historians are still trying to fully understand. The story gets even more interesting from here, I promise you that. Now here is where the story takes a turn that will surprise you. While millions of American men were losing their jobs, standing in unemployment lines, watching their entire identities as breadwinners crumble, something strange was happening with women's employment, something that contradicts everything we think we know about the Great Depression. Are you ready for this? Women's employment actually went up, not down, up. I know what you are thinking, that cannot be right. How could women's jobs increase during the worst economic catastrophe in American history? But the numbers do not lie. In 1930, there were 10.5 million women working outside the home in the United States. By 1940, that number had climbed to 13 million. That is an increase of 24%. Nearly 2.5 million more women working, while the male unemployment rate was sometimes hitting 25%. How is that even possible? The answer lies in something historians call occupational segregation, though that phrase does not really capture the full picture. Let me explain it this way. Imagine the American economy as a house with many rooms. Some rooms, like coal mining, heavy manufacturing, construction, steel production, those were considered men's rooms. And when the stock market crashed, those rooms collapsed first and hardest. Coal mines shut down, factories closed, construction stopped, steel mills went dark, and the men who worked in those industries, they had nowhere else to go. But there were other rooms in this house, quieter rooms, less prestigious rooms, rooms that paid terribly but never quite closed their doors. Teaching, nursing, clerical work, telephone operating, domestic service. These were considered women's work. And here is the thing about women's work in 1930s America. It was so undervalued, so underpaid, so beneath the dignity that men expected from employment, that even during the Depression these jobs remained relatively stable. Susan Ware, a historian who literally wrote the book on American women in the 1930s, put it perfectly. She said that some of the hardest hit industries like coal mining and manufacturing were where men predominated, while women were more insulated from job loss because they were employed in more stable industries. But, and this is crucial, stable did not mean good. Stable did not mean fair. Stable just meant these jobs still existed, even if they barely paid enough to survive. Let me introduce you to a woman named Margaret. She is not real, but she represents thousands of real women whose stories follow the same pattern. Margaret was a school teacher in Ohio. She had been teaching for 8 years, ever since she graduated from the state normal school. She earned about $1,200 a year, which was not great, but it was steady. She had her own apartment, a small circle of friends, and a life she had built for herself. Then her father lost his job at the manufacturing plant where he had worked for 20 years. Then her brother lost his job. Suddenly, Margaret was not just supporting herself, she was the only person in her entire family bringing in any money at all. This happened to countless women during the Depression. There is even a term for it, the added worker effect. Women who might have preferred to stay home, or who might have worked part-time, or who were planning to quit when they got married, they suddenly became the primary breadwinners for their entire families. Daughters supported unemployed fathers. Wives supported unemployed husbands, despite enormous social pressure against married women working. Sisters supported unemployed brothers. The whole structure of the male breadwinner family turned upside down, but quietly behind closed doors because nobody wanted to admit it was happening. And here is the heartbreaking part. Even though these women were keeping their families alive, even though they were the only thing standing between their loved ones and complete destitution, they were paid a fraction of what men had earned. I am not exaggerating. The National Recovery Administration, which was supposed to help stabilize the economy, actually wrote it into their wage codes. Over 25% of their codes set lower minimum wages for women than for men doing the exact same work. The same work, same hours, same tasks, less pay, because they were women. Let me give you a specific example of how absurd this was. In some clerical positions, a woman might earn $15 a week while a man in the identical position earned $25 a week. When employers were asked why, they had a ready answer. Men need to support families. But what about the women who were supporting families? What about Margaret, keeping her father and brother from starving? Apparently that did not count the same way. And if you were a woman of colour, the situation was exponentially worse. Black women and Hispanic women were largely shut out of the jobs available to white women. Teaching positions for white women. Nursing, white women. Office work, white women. Black women were overwhelmingly confined to domestic service, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes in other people's homes. And these jobs were not just low-paying, they were often humiliating and dangerous. You worked in someone else's house, subject to their whims, their schedules, their sometimes predatory behavior with absolutely no legal protection. Here is something that will make your blood boil. During the Depression, when white workers lost their jobs, they sometimes took over the positions that had previously been held by black workers, positions they would have considered beneath them in better times. Some black women who had managed to find work outside of domestic service found themselves fired so that white women could take their places, and when they went back to domestic service, they found that employers were paying even less than before because they could. What were these women going to do? There was no other option. Let me paint you a picture of what a day looked like for a domestic worker in 1935. You wake up at 5 in the morning in your small room, maybe in a boarding house, maybe sharing a space with 2 or 3 other women. You take the streetcar across town to the wealthy neighborhood where your employer lives. You let yourself in through the back door, never the front. You spend the next 10 to 12 hours cooking, cleaning, doing laundry by hand, scrubbing floors on your knees. Your employer might speak to you kindly, or she might treat you like furniture. You eat whatever leftovers she allows you to have, and at the end of the week you might earn $5 or $6, maybe less. Now imagine you are sending half of that money back to your mother in another state because she has no income at all. You're paying for your tiny room. You need to eat on the days you're not working. You need a winter coat because it is freezing and yours has holes in it. You need shoes because yours are worn through. Tell me, how do you make that math work? The answer is you do not. You go without. You skip meals. You wear the coat with holes. You put cardboard in your shoes. And you never ever complain because there are 100 other women who would take your job if you lost it. But wait, there is another layer to this paradox that we need to talk about. The marriage bars. Have you ever heard of these? They were policies, sometimes laws, that forbade married women from holding certain jobs. The logic went like this. There are not enough jobs for everyone, so if a woman has a husband, she does not need to work, and she should give up her job so an unemployed man can have it. Never mind if her husband was unemployed. Never mind if his income was not enough. Never mind if she actually liked working and was good at her job. If she was married, she was expected to quit. In 1930, 9 states had these marriage bar laws for state government jobs. By 1940, 26 states had them. 26. And it was not just government, banks, insurance companies, publishing houses, school districts. They all had policies against employing married women. Some were official policies, some were just understood rules. But the effect was the same: get married, lose your job, and women found creative ways around this. Some got married in secret, not telling their employers, living in constant fear that someone would find out. Can you imagine? You fall in love, you want to build a life with someone, but you have to hide your marriage like it is some kind of crime because telling the truth means losing your livelihood. Some women kept their maiden names at work, some removed their wedding rings every morning. Some even maintained separate addresses on paper. In 1933, the federal government made this even harder. They started requiring women with federal jobs to use their husbands' names. So if Mary Johnson married John Smith, she had to become Mary Smith at work, which immediately flagged her as married, which often meant she lost her job. The cruelty of this policy is stunning. It was designed specifically to make it impossible for married women to hide their status. And yet, and this is what I find so remarkable about human resilience, despite all of this, despite the discrimination and the marriage bars and the lower wages and the stigma, the number of married women in the workforce actually increased during the Depression. Because survival mattered more than stigma. Because keeping your family fed mattered more than following social conventions. Because women did what they had to do. Let me share with you one more story that captures the complexity of this moment. There were jobs created under the New Deal's Works Progress Administration that were specifically for women. On the surface, that sounds progressive, right? Jobs for women. But look closer at what these jobs were. Sewing rooms, that is right. While men were building bridges and roads and dams and parks, infrastructure that would last for generations and that they could point to with pride, women were assigned to sewing rooms where they made clothes and mattresses for needy families. Necessary work? Sure, but also work that reinforced exactly where society thought women belonged, with a needle and thread, doing domestic tasks, even when those tasks were for the government. The whole thing was a study in contradictions. Women's employment went up, but it was in the lowest paid, least respected sectors. Women kept families afloat, but they were criticized for taking jobs from men. Women wanted to work, but society told them they were being selfish. Women needed to work, but marriage bars tried to force them out of the workforce. Women were essential to the economy, but invisible in the policies designed to rebuild it. You know what strikes me most about this era? These women were performing an impossible balancing act. They had to be respectable enough to keep their jobs, because any hint of impropriety could get you fired. They had to be competent enough to be indispensable, because competent women were harder to replace than incompetent ones. They had to be humble enough not to threaten male egos, because a woman who seemed too ambitious or too capable could find herself out of work. And they had to do all of this while earning a fraction of what men earned and dealing with society's constant message that they should not be working at all. The employment paradox of the 1930s reveals something profound about how economic crises affect different groups differently. Yes, men suffered terribly during the Depression. I am not minimizing that at all. But men's suffering was visible, acknowledged, addressed through policy. Women's suffering was often invisible, denied, or blamed on the women themselves. And single women? They were the most invisible of all. So when we look back at the Great Depression and we see those images of men in bread lines, let us also imagine the women who were not in those lines. The teachers coming home exhausted after a day of managing overcrowded classrooms for poverty wages. The secretaries typing letters for bosses who earned 5 times their salary. The domestic workers scrubbing floors in houses nicer than anywhere they would ever live. The telephone operators connecting calls for hours on end. The nurses caring for patients in understaffed hospitals. All of these women working, surviving, holding their worlds together with sheer determination and grace under impossible pressure. Their jobs increased not because society valued them more, but because their work was valued so little that even in a depression, employers could still afford to pay them almost nothing. That is the real paradox, and that is the truth we need to sit with for a moment. But having a job, even a terrible, underpaid, exhausting job, was only part of the battle these women faced. Because at the end of each long workday they had to go home. And for single women in 1930s America, finding a safe, affordable place to live was its own special kind of nightmare. That is where we are headed next, into the boarding houses and rooming houses and women's hotels that shape their daily lives in ways you probably never imagined. So you have worked all day. Maybe you are a typist who spent 9 hours hunched over a keyboard, your fingers aching. Maybe you are a shop girl who stood behind a counter smiling at customers who treated you like you were invisible. Maybe you just finished scrubbing someone else's kitchen floor until your knees are bruised and your back is screaming. All you want now is to go home, right? To have a place that is yours, where you can close the door, take off your shoes, and just breathe. Except here is the problem. In 1930s America, if you were a single woman, finding that place, a safe, affordable, decent place to call home, was almost as hard as finding the job in the first place. Think about this for a moment. Where would you live if you were on your own in, say, 1932? You cannot afford your own apartment. Those cost at least $20 to $30 a month, and you're only making $18 a week on a good week. You cannot live with family. Maybe they are in another state, Or maybe they are struggling so badly themselves that another mouth to feed would break them. Most hotels in major cities had explicit policies against renting rooms to unaccompanied women. That is right. A single woman could not just walk into a hotel and rent a room like a man could. It was considered improper, suspicious. What kind of woman would be travelling alone? What kind of woman would need a hotel room without a male chaperone? You can almost hear the judgment dripping from those questions, can you not? So where did single women actually live? The answer for most was boarding houses or rooming houses, and let me tell you, these places were a world unto themselves. Picture a large house, maybe one that used to belong to a wealthy family before they lost everything in the crash. Now it has been subdivided and sub-subdivided into as many tiny rooms as physically possible. The owner needs to make money, and the way to maximize profit is to cram in as many paying tenants as you can. In 1910, there were around 68,000 women boarders in Manhattan alone. By the 1930s, that number had grown significantly. These were not cozy little guest rooms with charming landlords who baked you cookies. These were businesses, often desperate businesses, trying to survive the Depression by squeezing every possible dollar out of every possible square foot. Let me walk you through what it was actually like. You rent a room, and I use that term loosely, for about $7 to $12 a week. For that price, you get a space barely big enough for a single bed, maybe a small dresser if you're lucky, and a chair. That is it. One tiny window if you are fortunate, but plenty of rooms had no windows at all, just 4 walls and a door. Privacy? Forget about it. The walls were so thin you could hear everything happening in the neighbouring rooms. Every conversation, every cough, every sob, because yes, there was a lot of sobbing in those boarding houses. You share one bathroom with 15, maybe 20 other people, sometimes more, and not a nice bathroom either. We're talking about one toilet, one sink, one bathtub for all these women. Hot water was available only on certain days. In some places, you were limited in the number of baths you could take per week. Can you imagine? You've been working all day, you're exhausted and dirty, and you cannot even take a bath because it is not your designated bath day. But wait, it gets worse. Many boarding houses had rules that would make a prison warden blush. No visitors after 8 post-meridium. Actually, in women's boarding houses, often no male visitors above the first floor at all. No cooking in your room, which meant you either paid extra for meals provided by the house, or you tried to survive on whatever cold food you could sneak in. No coming home after 10 post-meridium without special permission. Some places had a matron who literally locked the front door at curfew, and if you were late, you slept on the street. And here is the thing that really stings. Women paid more than men for worse accommodations. Historians have documented this clearly. A man could rent a similar room for less money, and with fewer restrictions. Why? Because boarding house owners knew that single women had fewer options. Where else were they going to go? The owners could charge more and impose stricter rules because these women were desperate. Let me introduce you to a real place that illustrates both the need and the indignity of this situation. In Worcester, Massachusetts, there was a place called St. Joseph's Home for Working Girls. It was run by the Sisters of Mercy, and on the surface it sounds nice, right? A home for working girls, but look at what that really meant. The women who lived there ranged in age from 18 to 84, though most were between 20 and 40. They were employed. The home required that. You had to have a job to live there. And even in 1930, during the early years of the Depression, only 5 out of over 100 residents were listed as unemployed. The home was not for women who needed help. It was for women who were already helping themselves but could not afford anything better. These women worked as teachers, nurses, factory workers, salespeople, office clerks. They were not charity cases. They were working women who simply could not afford the cost of independent living. And even at St. Joseph's, which by all accounts was one of the better options available, life was institutional. Shared rooms, strict schedules, rules about behaviour. It was safe and it was affordable, but it was not exactly home. Now, if you had a bit more money, maybe you were a teacher or a head clerk or someone with a steady, slightly better paying job, you might aspire to something fancier, a women's residential hotel. And the most famous of these was the Barbizon Hotel for Women in New York City, which opened in 1927. The Barbizon. It sounds glamorous, does it not? And it was, compared to the alternatives. It housed secretaries, aspiring actresses, writers, artists. Years later, it would be home to women like Grace Kelly, Joan Didion, and Sylvia Plath, who based part of the Bell Jar on her experience there. But even the Barbizon reveals the constraints these women lived under. Yes, the public rooms were beautiful. Elegant lobbies where you could read or play piano, dining rooms with proper table service. But the actual bedrooms? Tiny. One window, a narrow bed, a small desk, a bureau. The rooms were deliberately kept small because more rooms meant more revenue, and the rules were strict: no men above the lobby floor, ever. A swimming pool and a gym, yes, but always under the watchful eye of staff who were there to maintain the reputation of the establishment. Because that was the thing about all of these women's residences. They were obsessed with respectability. The whole concept grew out of what they called moral reform movements in the late 1800s. Wealthy Christian women were horrified, just horrified, at the idea of young single women living in cities without proper supervision. They called these women girls adrift, as if they were boats that had come loose from their moorings and were floating dangerously toward moral ruin. So these well-meaning reformers created organized homes and Christian residences where young women could live in what they considered appropriate conditions, which meant strict curfews, mandatory church attendance in some cases, absolutely no male visitors, and a matron. They actually called her Mother, who monitored everyone's behaviour. The women who lived there were called daughters. Even if you were 35 years old and had been supporting yourself for a decade, you were still somebody's daughter who needed supervision. Can you imagine how infantilizing that must have felt? You are an adult woman, working a job, paying your own way, and yet you are treated like a child who cannot be trusted to make her own decisions about when to come home or who to talk to. But here is the catch. These places, restrictive as they were still better than the alternatives. Because the alternative might be a commercial rooming house in a sketchy neighbourhood where the landlord did not care about your safety or your reputation. Or it might be doubling up with 3 other women in a space meant for one just to afford the rent. Or it might be one of those truly grim situations where you rented what they called a light housekeeping room. Basically, you did cleaning and cooking for the landlord in exchange for a place to sleep. Some women got creative. They formed small cooperatives, pooling their money to rent a slightly larger apartment together and sharing everything: food, clothes, expenses. This was technically against the rules in many places, as boarding houses and apartment buildings often had occupancy limits designed to keep out this kind of arrangement. But women did it anyway because it was the only way to survive. And then there were the women who fell through even these meagre cracks, the ones who lost their jobs and could not make rent. In New York in the early 1930s, before that protest we talked about earlier, these women had nowhere to turn. They slept in train stations. They slept in churches that would let them in. They slept in all-night cafeterias, buying a cup of coffee and nursing it for hours just to have a warm place to sit. Some slept in parks when the weather allowed. Where are these women in the photographs? Where are they in the historical record? Mostly they are not there, because a homeless woman was even more invisible than a housed one. I want you to think about what it does to a person's sense of self to live like this. You work hard, you follow the rules, you try to be respectable and responsible, and yet you cannot have the basic human dignity of a private space that is truly yours. You cannot paint the walls a colour you like. You cannot have friends over for dinner. You cannot play music after a certain hour. You cannot come home late because you stayed to watch the stars. Every aspect of your life is regulated, monitored, restricted, and underneath all of this was the constant message: this is temporary. You're not supposed to be living like this. You are supposed to be married, living in your husband's home under his protection. The fact that you are here, in this boarding house or residential hotel, means something has gone wrong with your life story. Never mind that marriage rates had plummeted. Never mind that you might actually prefer independence. Never mind that you might be supporting your entire family on your tiny salary. Society's narrative said you were supposed to be attached to a man, and if you were not, well, this substandard housing was what you deserved. I think about those women lying in their narrow beds at night in those tiny rooms, hearing the sounds of dozens of other women in their tiny rooms, all of them trying to carve out some small space of autonomy in a world that offered them so few options. Were they dreaming of better lives? Were they making plans? Were they just too exhausted to dream at all? The housing crisis for single women in the 1930s reveals something we often forget. Having a job is not enough. You also need a place to live that you can afford and that treats you with basic human dignity. And for single women in this era, that was almost impossible to find. They were caught between economics that made independent living unaffordable and social rules that made it nearly impossible even when you could scrape together the money. By the 1950s, many of these boarding houses and women's hotels would close or convert to other uses, as social attitudes shifted and women gained more economic freedom. The Barbizon itself would eventually become a luxury condominium. But in the 1930s, these places were packed with women who had no better options, women who were making it work despite everything stacked against them. So now you have a picture of their lives, working jobs that barely paid enough to survive, living in cramped, regulated space that barely felt like home. And yet, even in the midst of all this struggle, these women still wanted the things all humans want: connection, romance, maybe even love. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of single women's lives in the 1930s, how they dated, who they dated, and what dating even meant in a world where everything, including romance, came with an economic price tag that most people could not afford to pay. Love in the time of the Depression. Sounds romantic, does it not? Like something out of a novel, but the reality was far more complicated, far more heartbreaking, and honestly, far more interesting than any romance novel could capture. Because by the 1930s, the entire game of courtship had changed in America, and single women found themselves navigating rules that were both brand new and brutally unforgiving. And here is the twist. Just when women needed emotional connection the most, the economic realities of dating made it harder than ever to find. Let me take you back a bit further first, because you cannot understand 1930s dating without understanding what came before. In the 1890s and early 1900s, if a young man was interested in a young woman, he would call on her. And I do not mean telephone, I mean he would literally come to her house, her territory, her family's parlour. The woman and her family controlled the entire interaction. They decided if he could visit. They decided how long he could stay. They served refreshments or they did not. The woman sat in her own home, surrounded by her family, and the man came into her space as a guest. She held all the cards. But then something revolutionary happened. Between the 1910s and 1920s, calling died and dating was born. And this shift was not just about semantics, it represented a fundamental transfer of power. because now the man asked the woman out. Out of her home, out into public spaces like restaurants, movie theatres, dance halls. And here is the kicker. He paid. The man paid for everything, which meant the man controlled everything. He decided where they went, when they went, how much was spent. The woman went from being the host in her own parlour to being a guest in his wallet. Now, you might be thinking, what is the big deal? Someone has to pay, right? But think about what this meant economically and socially. In the old calling system, seeing someone did not cost money. You sat in a parlour and talked. Maybe someone played piano. Maybe you had tea that the family already had. But dating? Dating required money for tickets, for meals, for drinks, for transportation. Dating turned romance into an economic transaction. And in the 1930s, when nobody had money, this became a massive problem. There is this fascinating study done by a sociologist named Willard Waller at Penn State College in the mid-1930s. He called it the rating and dating complex, and what he discovered would make your head spin. He found that dating had become less about finding a marriage partner and more about accumulating social status. It was a competition. Young people, especially in the colleges and among the middle class, dated multiple people not because they were looking for love, but because being seen with many different dates raised your popularity rating. For men, your rating depended on material things. Did you have access to a car? That was huge. Did you have nice clothes? Could you afford to take a girl to nice places? Your value in the dating market was directly tied to your purchasing power. And in the Depression, when young men were struggling to find work, when cars were luxuries most could not afford, their ability to compete in this dating market plummeted. But for women? Oh, the rules for women were even more twisted. Your rating depended on your reputation for being popular. You had to be seen with many desirable men. You had to turn down last-minute date requests, even if the request came weeks in advance, because accepting made you seem desperate, like you did not have other options. You had to cultivate this image of being in constant demand. One advice article from 1940 actually said, "The modern girl cultivates not one single suitor, but dates, lots of them." Your goal was not to find one good match. It was to collect as many dates as possible to prove you were desirable. Can you imagine the pressure? You are a single woman, maybe working full-time, maybe barely making ends meet, and now you also have to perform this elaborate social dance where you pretend to have multiple suitors fighting for your attention, even when the reality is and you might be lucky to have one person interested in you. And here is where the economics really bite. Remember, the man pays, always. A woman suggesting she split the bill, they called it Dutch dating, was considered almost scandalous. It was seen as an attack on masculinity. One 1930s etiquette guide said that Dutch dating demonstrated independence on the part of the woman which would threaten the masculinity of the man. Think about that. A woman offering to pay her own way was not seen as fair or generous. It was seen as emasculating. So what happened during the Depression when men could not afford to pay? Dating decreased dramatically. Young couples who might have gone out 2 or 3 times a week were now lucky to go out once a month. The expectation remained that the man should pay, but the ability to pay evaporated. And this created this awful tension where both people wanted to spend time together, but the economics made it nearly impossible. Some couples got creative. They went on what we might call free dates. Walking in the park, sitting on the front porch, window shopping, literally just looking at things in store windows they could not afford to buy. Some would go to free concerts or community events. Others would just sit in parked cars and talk, which led to the rise of what they called parking. Young couples making out in automobiles parked in secluded spots. The privacy of an enclosed car became one of the few free spaces where young people could be intimate without spending money. But here is something darker we need to talk about. The practice of treating. This emerged among working-class women in cities, and it walked a very fine line. Treating meant that a woman would provide companionship, flirtation, and sometimes sexual favours in exchange for a man paying for entertainment, meals, gifts, or other items she needed. Reformers called these women charity girls to distinguish them from prostitutes, but the line was blurrier than anyone wanted to admit. These were not women selling sex for money directly. These were working women, shop girls, factory workers, office clerks who earned so little that they literally could not afford to have any social life without male financial support. So they would go out with men who would buy them dinner, take them dancing, maybe give them small gifts. And in exchange, there was an expectation of intimacy. Not always sex, but definitely more than a goodnight handshake. Now, here is what is fascinating. The reformers who were horrified by this practice, they wanted to rescue these women. But when they actually talked to the so-called charity girls, the women were not interested in being rescued. They did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as making practical choices in a world with limited options. They wanted to have fun, to go dancing, to see movies, to have nice things. And if the only way to afford those things was to let men pay in exchange for companionship, well, that was the game everyone was playing anyway, just with the stakes a bit more explicitly stated. This is where we see how dating had become completely transactional. Even in supposedly respectable middle-class dating, there was an unspoken exchange. Men provided financial resources. Women provided social and potentially sexual access. The difference between a respectable date and treating was often just about how openly this exchange was acknowledged. And the pressure on women to play this game correctly was immense. Magazine articles and etiquette guides from the 1930s are filled with rules, exhausting, contradictory rules. Do not chew gum in front of your date. Do not apply makeup in front of him. Do not cry, especially in public, because men do not like emotional women. Do not drink too much at dinner. Do not be too smart or display too much independence. Do not talk about serious topics. Do be entertaining, amusing, a good dancer, able to fit in anywhere. Do be beautiful but not vain. Do be interested in him but not clingy. A syndicated advice columnist named Dorothy Dix wrote that a woman had to know how to be entertaining and amusing, how to dance and play a good game of bridge, how to fit in any company. Only senile grandfathers fall for the beautiful but dumb. So you had to be beautiful and smart but not too smart, fun but not frivolous, available but not desperate. It was an impossible standard, and underneath all of this was the clock ticking. Because while the 1920s and 30s saw women entering the workforce and living independently, society still expected women to marry. And if you were not married by your mid-20s, people started to wonder what was wrong with you. By 30, you were considered on the shelf, past your prime, a failure at the most important job a woman had, finding a husband. But remember what we talked about earlier. Marriage rates dropped 22% during the Depression. Young men could not afford to marry. Setting up a household required furniture, rent deposits, kitchen equipment. Weddings, even simple ones, cost money. Supporting a wife when you could barely support yourself was impossible, so couples who wanted to marry had to wait. And wait, and wait some more. This created a generation of women who existed in this strange limbo. Too old to be considered young and desirable by societal standards, but unable to marry because of economic circumstances beyond their control. And society blamed them anyway. If you were an unmarried woman over 30, people assumed something was wrong with you personally. You were too picky, too career-focused, not feminine enough, not attractive enough. It could not possibly be that the entire economic system had collapsed and made marriage financially impossible. No, it had to be your personal failing. Some advice columnists actually told women over 30 to be aggressive in pursuing men. Dorothy Dix, who I mentioned earlier, said that older single women should pick out the particular men they desire to have for husbands and go in for a whirlwind campaign. But, and here is the impossible part, they had to do this while never letting the man suspect that she was being the aggressor, because men did not like aggressive women. So you were supposed to pursue marriage desperately while appearing completely casual about it. Make it make sense. The dating culture of the 1930s also reveals the beginning of what we now call going steady, when a couple decided to date each other exclusively. But this did not really take off until the 40s. In the 30s, exclusivity was often seen as limiting your options in that competitive dating market. If you went steady too early, you might miss out on dating someone better who could raise your social rating. And here is something that might surprise you. Despite all the rules and restrictions and economic barriers, despite the pressure to be chaste and respectable, sexual behavior was changing. Surveys from this era found that 34% of women who came of age in the 1910s and 20s reported having premarital sex, compared to only 14% of women born before 1900. That is more than double. The so-called sexual revolution of the 60s did not come out of nowhere. It had roots in the changing attitudes of the 20s and 30s. But for single women, sexual activity came with enormous risks. Pregnancy outside of marriage could ruin your life. You would lose your job. Your boarding house would kick you out. Your family might disown you. Contraception existed but was unreliable and often illegal. Abortion was illegal and dangerous. So women who chose to be sexually active were taking huge gambles with their entire futures. And if you were a woman who was not interested in men at all, if you were a lesbian or bisexual in the 1930s, you existed in the deepest shadows. There were quiet communities, especially in big cities, especially in some of those boarding houses and residential hotels where women lived together. But you could never be open about it, never acknowledge it publicly. Your entire romantic life had to be conducted in secret, in coded language, always with the fear of discovery. The dating culture of the Great Depression era shows us something profound about how economic crisis affects not just material life but emotional life too. When people cannot afford the social rituals that are supposed to lead to partnership. When the traditional path to marriage is blocked by poverty, what happens to human connection? What happens to love? The answer is, it gets complicated, it gets transactional, it gets competitive, it gets desperate. But it also gets creative. People find ways. They walk in parks instead of going to restaurants. They sit on porches instead of going to movies. They create intimacy in the spaces between the rules, in the cracks of a system that is not built for them. And through it all, single women are navigating this impossible maze of expectations. Be popular but not promiscuous. Be attractive but not vain. Be fun but not frivolous. Pursue marriage but not too obviously. Accept that men pay, but do not let it make you feel like you owe them anything, even though everyone knows you do. Live independently, but remember this is temporary. You're supposed to find a husband. And do all of this on about $15 a week while living in a boarding house with a 10 post-meridiem curfew. The resilience it took to maintain hope for connection and romance under these circumstances is staggering. And yet these women kept trying, kept putting on lipstick and going to dances, kept smiling at men who might be able to afford to take them to dinner, kept believing that somehow, despite everything, they might find someone to build a life with. Speaking of lipstick, though, that is a whole other story. And it is one of the most surprising aspects of single women's lives in the Depression. Because while you might think makeup and beauty products would be luxuries nobody could afford, Something remarkable happened instead. The beauty industry exploded. And the reasons why tell us something fascinating about what these women valued and how they survived. Let us talk about that next. Here is a riddle for you. What luxury item saw its sales double during the worst economic catastrophe in American history? What product did women buy more of when they could barely afford food? The answer is going to surprise you. Lipstick, makeup, beauty products. While banks were failing and factories were closing and millions were losing everything, cosmetic sales in America doubled during the 1930s. Doubled. How is that even possible? And more importantly, what does it tell us about what mattered to single women trying to survive in impossible circumstances? Let me start with the story that captures this beautifully. It is 1932. You're a young woman working as a stenographer in downtown Chicago. You have not bought a new dress in 8 months. You're eating one proper meal a day and filling the gaps with bread and apples. Your shoes have cardboard stuffed in the soles because you cannot afford to get them resoled, let alone buy new ones. Your winter coat has a tear in the lining that you keep meaning to sew but have not found the time. By every measure, you are struggling. You are broke. And yet, when you pass by the Woolworths 5 and dime on your lunch break, you stop. You go inside and you spend 50 cents, 50 precious cents that you should probably use for food, on a tube of lipstick, a deep red called Tangy, or maybe Max Factor's new shade. You do not buy the dress, you do not fix the shoes, but you buy the lipstick. Why? Because in that moment, that lipstick represents something more valuable than 50 cents worth of food. It represents the possibility that you still matter, that you are still visible, that you have not disappeared entirely into the greyness of the depression. For the price of a lipstick, you can look in the mirror and see someone who still exists as more than just a struggling worker trying to survive. You can see a woman. This is what historians call the lipstick effect, and it is a real psychological and economic phenomenon. When times are really hard, when people cannot afford big luxuries like new clothes or vacations or nice furniture, they turn to small luxuries to maintain some sense of normalcy and self-worth. And in the 1930s, for women, that small luxury was makeup. A tube of lipstick cost anywhere from 10 cents for a basic drugstore brand to maybe $1 for a fancy department store version. Even a woman making $15 a week could afford that. And oh, the difference it made. But it was not just about feeling pretty. For working women, especially single women, looking presentable was literally a job requirement. Let me explain what I mean by that. In the previous sections, we talked about how single women were working in offices, in shops, as teachers, as nurses. These were public-facing jobs where appearance mattered. Employers expected their female workers to look neat, well-groomed and attractive. Not glamorous, that would be inappropriate, but definitely presentable. If you showed up to work as a secretary looking haggard and unkempt, you would not keep that job for long. So makeup became a tool of economic survival. It was not vanity, it was strategy. You put on lipstick and powder not because you were frivolous, but because looking tired and poor could cost you your livelihood. Your appearance had to say, I am respectable, I am competent, I am worth employing. And makeup helped create that image, even when the reality underneath was exhaustion and desperation. Now, let us talk about what makeup actually looked like in the 1930s, because it was quite different from what had come before. In the 1920s, the flapper look was all about drama. Dark, kohl-rimmed eyes, thin, drawn-on eyebrows, small bow-shaped lips painted dark. The whole aesthetic was a bit vampish, a bit dangerous, very dramatic, but by the 30s that look was out, completely out. The new ideal was softer, more feminine, more, And this word appears over and over in beauty articles from the era, more natural. Though let me tell you, natural in 1930s terms still required a lot of products. The look was all about creating an illusion of effortless, blooming femininity. And where did this ideal come from? Hollywood. This is the era when movies truly became a mass cultural force. By the mid-30s, millions of Americans were going to the movies every single week. Some estimates suggest that 60 million people, half the country's population, went to the movies weekly. And on those silver screens they saw faces that became the definition of beauty. Greta Garbo with her mysterious allure. Jean Harlow with her platinum blonde hair, achieved, by the way, through a dangerous combination of peroxide, ammonia, Clorox, and Lux soap flakes that her hairdresser later admitted could have killed her. Marlene Dietrich with her sculpted cheekbones. Joan Crawford with her wide, dramatic mouth. These women were goddesses, untouchable, impossibly glamorous, and yet magazines and advertisers told ordinary women that they too could look like this, if only they bought the right products. It was brilliant marketing, really. You cannot afford a new dress, but you can afford the same lipstick shade that Claudette Colbert wears. You cannot go to fancy restaurants, but you can pencil your eyebrows the way Greta Garbo does. For just a few coins, you could buy a tiny piece of Hollywood magic, and the beauty industry exploded to meet this demand. Companies like Max Factor, Elizabeth Arden, Helena Rubinstein, they were not just selling products, they were selling transformation, hope, possibility. Max Factor, who actually worked with movie stars to create their on-screen looks, launched innovations like lip gloss in the early 30s and then pancake makeup in 1937. Pancake was revolutionary. A water-based foundation that gave you that smooth, matte, flawless complexion the camera loved. Before Pancake, most foundations were greasy and heavy. This was lighter, easier to apply, and it looked more natural. Helena Rubinstein introduced the first commercial waterproof mascara in 1939. Before that, if you cried or got caught in the rain, your mascara ran down your face in black streaks. But waterproof mascara, that was freedom! You could have dark, defined lashes without worrying about smudging. Now let me walk you through what an actual 1930s makeup routine looked like, because it tells you so much about what women were striving for. You would start with your base, foundation or powder to create that pale, smooth complexion. Tanned skin was just starting to become acceptable, but most women still aimed for lighter skin. If you wanted that movie star glow, you might apply a bit of petroleum jelly or olive oil on your eyelids for shine. That is right, cooking oil as eyeshadow base. Depression-era beauty hacks at their finest. Eyeshadow, when you used it, was in soft colours. Blues, greens, mauves, even a bit of gold or silver for evening. Nothing too heavy. You wanted your eyes to look large and luminous, not dark and dramatic. And then there were the eyebrows. Oh, the eyebrows. If you have thin eyebrows now, you would have been perfectly on trend in the 30s. Women plucked their brows to pencil-thin lines, sometimes removing them entirely and drawing them back in with a makeup pencil. The arch was high, sweeping up toward the temples. It created this surprised, youthful look that was considered incredibly elegant. Mascara was essential. You wanted dark, separated lashes, not thick and clumpy like modern mascara ads show, but defined and individual. Some women used henna to stain their lashes, which lasted longer but were pretty harsh. Others used cake mascara, which came in a little compact with a brush, and you wet the brush and scraped it across the cake to build up colour. It was time-consuming but effective. Rouge, what we call blush now, was applied very carefully. You were trying to create a subtle flush of health and youth, not bright circles of colour on your cheeks. Some women even applied a tiny bit of rouge to their earlobes, because apparently that looked fresh and blooming, Beauty guides actually instructed women to put rouge on the outer edge of the ear if it was exposed beneath the hair. Can you imagine? We worry about contouring our cheekbones, and they were contouring their ears. But the real star of 1930s makeup was the lip. Lips were full, slightly overdrawn to create a pillowy effect, and shaped into what they called a Cupid's bow. 2 distinct peaks on the upper lip and a full rounded lower lip. And the colour? Red. Almost always red. Deep reds, blue reds, orange reds, burgundy reds. Red lips were not considered provocative or trashy. They were sophisticated and polished. Even First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt wore red lipstick, and Elizabeth Arden famously distributed red lipstick to suffragettes to show support for their cause. Applying lipstick was an art form. You used a lip brush to carefully outline and fill in your lips, then you blotted with tissue, then you applied another layer, then you blotted again. This was how you got lipstick that stayed on, because the formulas back then were heavy and waxy. They did not have the staying power of modern lipsticks, so you had to build up layers. Some women would seal their lipstick with a light dusting of powder, though that made it even more likely to transfer onto everything you ate or drank or, heaven forbid, kissed. Actually, that leads me to a funny aside. Men at the time had very mixed feelings about lipstick. Some found it incredibly erotic and attractive. Others complained constantly about getting lipstick on their collars, their handkerchiefs, their faces. One advice columnist told women never to blot their lips with their date's handkerchief, as if women were just going around wiping their mouths on random men's pocket squares. The struggle was real, apparently. But here is what I find most poignant about the 1930s beauty boom. It happened during the Depression, not despite it, but because of it. When everything else in your life feels out of control, when you've lost your savings or your job or your home or your marriage prospects, being able to control how you look becomes incredibly important. You cannot control the economy. You cannot make employers pay you fairly. You cannot make men able to afford to marry you. But you can put on lipstick. You can style your hair. You can present a face to the world that says, I am still here. I still matter. Women in the 30s would go to beauty salons for weekly hair appointments if they could possibly afford it. A wash and set might cost 50 cents to $1, a significant expense, but one women prioritized. They needed those finger waves, those pin curls, those Marcel waves that were the height of fashion. At night, they would sleep in rag curlers or use metal wavers heated on the stove to maintain their hairstyles between salon visits. Can you imagine sleeping with your head full of uncomfortable rollers or rags night after night because looking polished at work was not optional? Elizabeth Arden, who was one of the most successful businesswomen of the era, understood this psychology perfectly. She opened luxurious beauty salons where women could escape for a few hours and be pampered. Her salons were decorated in her signature colours, pink and white, with a touch of Art Deco glamour. She added fitness studios in the 30s, tapping into the growing interest in health and wellness. For a few dollars, a working woman could feel like she was living a glamorous life, even if it was just for an hour. And Arden's marketing was genius. Her advertisements and catalogues did not just sell products, they sold a lifestyle. Beautiful brochures with metallic silver backgrounds and elegant illustrations showed women what they could become. The message was clear. You may be struggling now, but you can still be beautiful. You can still be elegant. You can still be somebody. Cosmetics companies also made their products accessible at different price points. Yes, you could buy expensive Elizabeth Arden products at a department store, but you could also buy perfectly decent makeup at Woolworths or your local drugstore for a fraction of the price. Brands like Tangy and Maybelline made beauty democratic. Every woman, regardless of her income, could participate in the beauty culture that Hollywood had created. There is something both inspiring and heartbreaking about all of this. Inspiring because it shows women refusing to let poverty strip them of their sense of self. Heartbreaking because they felt they had to maintain this polished appearance just to be treated with basic dignity and respect. They had to spend money they desperately needed for other things on makeup and hairstyling, because showing up looking poor could cost them their jobs, their marriage prospects, their place in respectable society. And let us be honest, the beauty standards were impossible. Movie stars had personal hairdressers, makeup artists, professional photographers who knew their best angles, and studio lighting that made everyone look flawless. Trying to recreate that in real life, in a tiny boarding house room with one small mirror and no professional help, using products you bought at Woolworths, it was never going to quite work. But women tried anyway, because what was the alternative? Give up entirely? I think about a woman getting ready for work in her small room, carefully applying her makeup by the light of one dim bulb, trying to create the illusion that everything is fine, that she is fine, that she has not been eating bread and apples for dinner most nights. She puts on her lipstick, checks her appearance one more time, and heads out to face another day of low pay and high expectations. That lipstick is armor. That makeup is survival. The beauty boom of the 1930s reveals something profound about how people cope with crisis. When you cannot control the big things, you control the small things. When you cannot fix the economy or change social structures or make enough money, you fix your face. You create a version of yourself that meets the standards, that fits the expectations, that gives you a fighting chance in a world that is already stacked against you. But of course, looking the part was only half the battle. You also needed to dress the part. And that brings us to one of the most creative and resourceful aspects of women's lives in the Depression. How they managed to stay fashionable when they had almost no money for clothes. The ingenuity is absolutely remarkable, and the stories will amaze you. Let us dive into the world of flour sack fashion and borrowed glamour. Imagine opening your kitchen cupboard and finding your next dress inside. I am not being metaphorical. I mean literally finding the fabric for your dress in a flour sack. Sounds absurd, right? But in the 1930s, this was reality for millions of American women. And here is the beautiful part. What started as desperate necessity became a genuine fashion movement, complete with flour companies competing to print the prettiest patterns on their sacks. The resourcefulness and creativity of Depression-era women, when it came to fashion, is honestly one of the most inspiring stories of this whole era. Let me paint you a picture of what fashion actually looked like in the 1930s, because it was gorgeous. The silhouette had completely changed from the 1920s. Gone was that boyish straight up and down flapper look with the dropped waist and knee-length hems. By 1933, fashion had returned to emphasizing the natural female form. Dresses had fitted waists at their natural position. Hems dropped to mid-calf or even ankle length. Shoulders were widened with pads or creative cutting. The overall effect was elegant, feminine, and sophisticated. Hollywood was driving these trends, of course. When you watched a movie and saw a glamorous actress in a bias-cut gown that draped and flowed like liquid silk, those dresses designed by people like Madeleine Vionnet, you wanted to look like that. The bias cut, where fabric is cut diagonally across the grain, made dresses hug your curves in this beautiful fluid way. It was sensual without being overtly sexual. Classy, grown-up, but here is the reality check. Those Hollywood dresses cost more money than most working women made in a year. So what did ordinary women do? They got creative, really creative. First, let us talk about what women actually wore day to day, because there were different categories of clothing based on where you were going and what you were doing. If you were a working woman heading to your office or shop job, you needed what they called a day dress or a street dress. This was usually made of sturdy fabric like cotton, rayon, or wool depending on the season. The cut would follow the fashionable silhouette: fitted bodice, natural waist, flared or straight skirt. Colours were often practical: navy, brown, black, dark green. Patterns might include small florals, polka dots, or subtle plaids. Now here is the thing: you probably owned one, maybe two of these work dresses. That is it. You wore the same dress multiple times a week. You washed it by hand in your boarding house sink. You pressed it with an iron you might have borrowed or shared. And you wore it again. The idea of having a different outfit for every day of the week? That was a fantasy for most working women. But you still needed to look presentable. Your employer expected it. Society expected it. So women became masters of accessories. A fresh white collar could make the same dress look different. A belt could change the whole silhouette. A brooch or a scarf added visual interest. Gloves. Gloves were essential for looking respectable when you went out. Even if your dress was shabby, clean gloves signaled that you cared about your appearance. Hats, too, were non-negotiable. No respectable woman went out in public without a hat in the 30s, and hats could be remarkably affordable. You could buy a simple felt cloche for under $1, or you could make one yourself with wire, fabric scraps, and creativity. Women's magazines were filled with articles on refreshing your hat with new ribbon, or flowers or feathers you salvaged from an old hat. One hat, endlessly reinvented. But let us get to the really interesting part: how women got new clothes when they had almost no money. The first and most common method was sewing their own. Most women in the 30s knew how to sew. It was not a hobby, it was a survival skill. You learned it from your mother, from school, from necessity, and patterns were relatively cheap. You could buy a paper pattern from companies like McCall's or Butterick for 15 or 25 cents, and then you just needed fabric. This is where things get fascinating. New fabric from a fabric store was expensive, so women scavenged fabric wherever they could find it. They would buy old dresses at thrift shops or rummage sales, carefully take them apart at the seams, and reuse the fabric to make something new. This was called make do and mend, and it was an art form. You had to look at a worn-out dress and see it not as trash, but as yards of potentially useful material. Curtains became dresses, tablecloths became blouses, blankets became coats. I am serious. Women looked at every piece of fabric in their lives and thought, could I wear this? And often the answer was yes. But the real stroke of genius, and this is where the flour sack story comes in, was when women started noticing that flour, sugar, and grain products came in cloth sacks, not paper, cloth. And initially these sacks were plain white or printed with the company logo in big letters. But women were so desperate for fabric that they would buy flour based on which sack had the most washable ink, so they could bleach out the logo and use the fabric. The textile and food companies noticed this, and instead of seeing it as a problem, they saw an opportunity. If women were going to make dresses from flour sacks anyway, why not make the sacks beautiful? So they started printing patterns on them: florals, plaids, gingham checks, cheerful prints in every colour you can imagine. Suddenly, buying a £25 sack of flour meant you also got enough fabric for a child's dress or a blouse. £100 sack. That was enough fabric for a woman's dress, and the companies marketed this heavily. "Our sacks make lovely garments," one ad proclaimed. Some companies even printed sewing instructions on the sacks. The flour industry was literally supporting the fashion industry, and both were helping women maintain their dignity during impossible times. Can you imagine the psychology of this? On one hand, it is brilliant recycling and resourcefulness. On the other hand, you are wearing a dress made from a flour sack because you cannot afford to buy fabric. That is humbling. But here is what I love. Women did not treat these flour sack dresses as shameful secrets. They shared tips on which brands had the best patterns. They traded sacks with neighbours to get enough matching fabric. They made beautiful things from packaging material and wore them proudly. There was even a specific style of dress that became popular during the Depression called the Hooverette, named sarcastically after President Herbert Hoover, who many people blame for not doing enough to help during the early Depression years. The Hooverette was a wrap dress made of inexpensive cotton percale. It was reversible, so you could wear it two different ways. It was washable, practical, and affordable. It was not glamorous, but it was smart. For housework, women wore what they called house dresses, and these were even simpler and more practical than their street clothes. Often made from flour sack fabric or other scraps, house dresses were loose, comfortable, and designed to withstand hard use. Because remember, even if you worked outside the home all day, you still came home to housework. No washing machines for most women, no dishwashers, everything done by hand, so you needed durable clothes that could survive sweat and water and scrubbing. But, and this is important, even house dresses followed the fashionable silhouette. Even at home, just with family, women wanted to feel put together. The dresses might be made from humble fabric, but the cut was current. The details mattered. This speaks to something deep in human nature, the desire to maintain self-respect even when circumstances are degrading. Now, what about those times when you needed to look really nice? A job interview maybe, or a date, or a church service. If you were lucky, you had one good dress. This was a dress you saved for special occasions, that you kept wrapped in tissue paper, that you protected fiercely from stains and wear. It might be made from rayon, which was a newer, more affordable silk alternative. It might have some special detail, a bit of lace at the collar maybe, or decorative buttons. This dress was precious because it represented your ability to look respectable when it really mattered. But many women did not even have one good dress of their own, so they borrowed from friends, from sisters, from cousins, from neighbours. There were informal networks of women who would lend clothes to each other for important occasions. "Can I borrow your navy dress for my interview on Tuesday?" was a common request. And women helped each other because they understood. They had all been there. Some women got creative with transforming their everyday clothes into evening wear. You could change the neckline with a different collar, add a sparkling brooch, wear your hair differently, put on your good shoes instead of your work shoes, use different accessories. Suddenly, the same dress looked dressy instead of dowdy. It was all about presentation. Coats were a particular challenge because they were expensive and you really needed one in winter. A good wool coat could cost $15 or $20, more than a week's wages for many women. So coats got worn for years, repaired endlessly, turned inside out when the outside got too shabby and resewn into a new coat. Collars were replaced when they got worn. Hems were lowered or raised to match current fashion. A coat was an investment that had to last. And shoes, oh, the shoes. You needed good shoes for work, shoes that looked presentable and would not fall apart after a month of daily wear. But shoes were expensive, and a decent pair might cost $3 or $4, which was a significant expense. So women would buy one pair of shoes and wear them until they literally fell apart. Then they would take them to a cobbler to be resoled, and resoled again and again. When the uppers finally gave out, maybe you could find a used pair at a charity shop or rummage sale. There is a detail from this era that breaks my heart. Women putting cardboard in their shoes when the soles wore through and they could not afford to repair them yet. Can you imagine walking to work in shoes with cardboard soles hoping it does not rain? The cardboard would get wet and disintegrate, and then you are essentially walking on bare feet inside a shoe shell. But what choice did you have? You could not go to work barefoot. Stockings, what we call pantyhose now, though they were separate stockings held up with garters then, were another constant expense. They were made of silk or rayon, and they snagged easily. A run in your stocking meant it was ruined, and you could not just throw it away and buy new ones, because stockings cost money. So women learned to mend runs with tiny, careful stitches, or they used nail polish to stop a run from spreading. Some women drew lines up the backs of their bare legs with eyebrow pencil to make it look like they were wearing stockings with seams. The creativity here is stunning. Women were essentially creating fashion illusions with almost no resources, and they had to because appearance was currency. Looking shabby could cost you a job, a marriage prospect, your place in respectable society. So they made dresses from flour sacks and drew stockings on their legs and wore the same coat for 5 years and somehow still managed to look put together. There is something both beautiful and tragic about this. Beautiful because it shows incredible resilience and creativity. Tragic because it should not have been necessary. These women were working hard, contributing to society, keeping their families afloat. They should not have had to wear flour sacks and cardboard shoes, but they did, and they did it with grace. Fashion magazines from the era are fascinating because they show this weird disconnect. On one hand, they are showing you these elaborate, expensive outfits from Paris fashion houses. On the other hand, they are also running articles on how to make over your old dress and sewing tips for the thrifty woman. The magazines understood their readers could not afford what they were showing, but they sold the dream anyway. And women bought into that dream because they needed it. They needed to believe that better times were coming, that someday they would be able to buy a new dress without wincing at the cost, that someday they could walk into a store and just purchase things instead of making everything by hand. The fashion in magazines was aspirational. It was hope in the form of beautiful illustrations. Some department stores actually offered layaway plans where you could pay for a dress or coat over several months. You would put down a small deposit and they would hold the item for you while you made payments. When you finished paying, you got your dress. This made more expensive items accessible, though of course it also meant you were committed to those payments even if your circumstances changed. There were also dress exchanges and consignment shops where women could sell or trade clothes they no longer wanted. You might bring in 3 dresses you were tired of wearing and trade them for 2 new-to-you dresses someone else brought in. It was recycling before recycling was trendy. It was sustainability born of necessity. And here is something I find remarkable. Despite all these constraints, despite the poverty and the make-do solutions and the flour sack dresses, women in the 1930s still managed to look elegant in photographs. You look at pictures from this era and you see women in well-fitted dresses, styled hair, careful makeup. You would never know from looking at them that they were struggling. That was the point. The appearance of normalcy was a form of resistance. It was saying, the depression has not broken me. I am still here. I still matter. But maintaining that appearance came at a cost, both financial and emotional. The constant pressure to look acceptable on no money was exhausting. The judgment if you failed to meet the standard was harsh. And all of this was happening while women were also dealing with everything else we have talked about. Inadequate housing, unfair wages, limited opportunities, an economic system that was not designed to support them, yet they kept going. They sewed their dresses and mended their stockings and shined their worn-out shoes and walked out the door each morning looking as good as they possibly could under impossible circumstances. That is courage. That is strength. But even as women were fighting these daily battles for survival and dignity, there was a larger fight happening too, because the government was creating programs to help Americans through the Depression, and single women discovered they'd been almost entirely left out of those programs. The New Deal, for all its promise, had a raw deal waiting for women who did not fit the traditional mold. And that story, that is where we need to go next. The New Deal. Even the name sounds hopeful, does it not? A New Deal for America. A fresh start, a government stepping in to rescue its citizens from the depths of economic catastrophe. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in 1933, he promised bold action and he delivered it. Programs sprang up with alphabet soup names: the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Recovery Administration, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Billions of dollars were spent. Millions of jobs were created. It was the largest government intervention in the economy America had ever seen. And for single women, it was almost as if they did not exist. Let me give you a number that will make you understand just how thoroughly single women were excluded from the New Deal. At its peak, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the largest of all the New Deal programs, employed about 8.5 million people. Guess how many were women? 14%. Just 14%. And remember, we talked earlier about how women's employment actually increased during the Depression, how women were working in huge numbers to support themselves and often their families too. But when it came to government relief jobs, suddenly there was almost no room for them. Why? Because the entire New Deal was built on a fundamental assumption: that America was made up of families with male breadwinners and female homemakers. The programs were designed to give jobs to men so they could support their wives and children. Women would benefit indirectly through their relationships to men. If your father got a job building a dam, your family was saved. If your husband got hired to work on a road crew, your household had income. The New Deal was built on the idea that fixing the male unemployment crisis would fix everything else. But what if you did not have a father who could work? What if you did not have a husband? What if you were one of those millions of single women trying to survive on your own? Then the New Deal did not really have a deal for you at all. Let me walk you through what this actually looked like in practice. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCE, was one of the most popular New Deal programs. It took young men out into the wilderness to do conservation work, planting trees, building trails, fighting fires, creating parks. The men lived in camps, got food and shelter, and earned $30 a month, 25 of which had to be sent home to their families. It was outdoor work, healthy work, work that gave young men purpose and dignity when they might otherwise have been idle and desperate. And the CC had a formal policy against hiring women. Not just a preference for men, an actual policy. Women were explicitly excluded. Eleanor Roosevelt herself protested this, but she lost that fight. The argument was that the work was too physically demanding for women, that it would not be appropriate for men and women to live in camps together, that women should be home anyway. So, 0 CC jobs went to women. 0. Now, to be fair, they did eventually create some camps specifically for young women under the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. But look at what happened there. The women were not sent out to plant forests or build trails. They were assigned to what? Sewing rooms. They made clothes, mattresses, and canned goods for distribution to needy families. Necessary work, sure, but notice the difference. Men were doing work that transformed the landscape, that built infrastructure we still use today. Women were doing domestic work, just in a government building instead of a private home, and even these limited opportunities for women were heavily racialized. Most of the women in these programs were white. When African American women or Mexican American women got government work at all, they were overwhelmingly assigned to be housekeeping aides, essentially servants sent to work in private homes. The government was paying them, but the work itself reinforced every racial and gender stereotype about who belonged where in the social hierarchy. Let us talk about the National Recovery Administration for a moment, because this one is particularly infuriating. The NRA was supposed to stabilize the economy by setting wage and hour standards for different industries. Sounds good, right? Fair wages for everyone. except that over 25% of the wage code specifically set lower minimum wages for women than for men doing identical work. Identical, the same job, the same hours, the same tasks, but if you were a woman, you got paid less by law, by federal law. The very programs that were supposed to help people out of poverty were legally codifying women's economic disadvantage. And then there is Social Security, which we now think of as one of the great achievements of the New Deal. The Social Security Act of 1935 created a safety net for older Americans and some categories of workers, but read carefully about who was excluded: agricultural workers and domestic servants. And who primarily worked in agriculture and domestic service? Women, especially women of colour. The two categories of work where you were most likely to find black women and Mexican American women were specifically carved out of Social Security protection. So let me make sure I am being clear about what this means. If you were a black woman working as a domestic servant in the 1930s, which was the reality for the vast majority of black women workers, you had no pension, no safety net, no Social Security benefits building up for your old age. You could work your entire life and you would have nothing to show for it except exhaustion. The federal government looked at your labour and decided it was not worth protecting. And the structure of Social Security benefits themselves was built around that male breadwinner model. Benefits were designed to provide for a man and his dependent wife. If you were a single woman who had worked your whole life and paid into the system, your benefits were calculated as if you were just supporting yourself. But a married man's benefits assumed he was supporting a wife who had not worked, even if she had. The whole system was built around the idea that women's economic rights came through men, not through their own labour. Here is another cruel detail. From 1932 to 1937, there were laws that made it illegal for more than one person per family to work for the federal government. On the surface, this sounds fair, spread the jobs around, right? But in practice, it almost always meant that if a husband and wife both worked for the government, the wife had to quit. Because of course the man's job was more important, his career mattered more. She was just working for pin money anyway, right? Never mind if her salary was essential to the family's survival. Never mind if she was actually better qualified, or had been in her position longer. The assumption was always that the woman should be the one to leave. Eleanor Roosevelt tried to fight this. She really did. She used her position as First Lady to advocate for women's inclusion in New Deal programs. She pushed for women to be appointed to government positions, and she succeeded in getting more women into federal jobs than any previous administration. She wrote newspaper columns and gave speeches about women's economic rights. But even the First Lady had limited power against the entrenched assumptions about gender roles. Let me tell you about one woman who did manage to make a difference, though. Her name was Ellen Woodward, and she ran the women's division of the Works Progress Administration. She fought constantly to get resources for women's projects, to expand the definition of what kind of work women could do, to increase the pathetically small percentage of WPA jobs that went to women. Because of her advocacy, some women got jobs beyond sewing rooms. There were WPA projects in education, in the arts, in record keeping and research. But she was fighting an uphill battle against an entire system that saw women's unemployment as less urgent, less important, less worthy of attention than men's. And let us talk about what happened to women who did manage to get on relief: government assistance. First, they had to prove they were truly needy, which often meant proving they had no male relatives who could support them. Imagine having to stand in a government office and explain that your father is dead, your brothers are unemployed, you have no husband, and please, please, could you have some help? The indignity of it. The shame that was built into the system, and relief was administered locally, which meant discrimination was rampant. Local officials could deny you help for almost any reason. If they thought you were not respectable enough, if they did not like your attitude, if you were black or Mexican or Chinese, if they thought you should just get married and let a man take care of you. The federal government provided the money, but local prejudices determined who got it. There is a report from 1937 about unattached women on relief in Chicago that is absolutely heartbreaking. It documents women who had worked for years, lost their jobs through no fault of their own, exhausted all their savings, sold everything they owned, and finally desperately applied for relief. And the report treats them with this tone of faint surprise, as if it is remarkable that these women actually needed help. As if being single and female meant you should somehow be able to survive on air and good intentions. The report also notes, almost in passing, that the white women in the study had lived in Chicago longer than the black women, referencing the great migration of African Americans from the South to northern cities. But it does not talk about why those black women had to migrate in the first place, or how much harder it was for them to find work, or how much less they were paid when they did find it. The structural racism is just treated as a given, not even worth commenting on. Now, I do not want to give the impression that the New Deal did nothing for women. Some women did get WPA jobs. Some did benefit from relief programs. The expansion of government created more clerical jobs, and women filled many of those positions. The National Youth Administration, which was part of the WPA, did provide some work and education opportunities for young women. But the scale of help was tiny compared to what men received, and the kind of help reflected deeply conservative ideas about women's proper place. And here is something that really gets me. While all this was happening, there was no organised feminist movement pushing back. The women's rights movement that had been so strong in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that had fought for and won the vote in 1920, that movement had lost momentum. The 1920s had seen declining interest in women's political organising, and by the 30s, with the economic crisis consuming everyone's attention, feminist activism was mostly dormant. The groups that had advocated for women's rights, organisations like the National Women's Party and the League of Women Voters, they still existed, but they were operating in the political background. The urgency of economic survival overshadowed demands for equal rights. Women were too busy trying to keep their jobs and feed their families to organise large-scale protests about systemic inequality, which makes the association of unemployed single women that we talked about earlier even more remarkable. That they organised at all, that they protested publicly, that they demanded recognition, that took enormous courage in an environment where single women were supposed to be grateful for whatever scraps they received. Think about the message the New Deal sent to single women. The federal government looked at the crisis and said, "We will help families by helping men. We will create jobs for men. We will provide security for men and their dependents. And if you are a woman who is not someone's dependent, well, you should try harder to become someone's dependent. Get married. Find a man. That is the solution to your problems. The idea that you might deserve help in your own right, as a person, as a worker, as a citizen, that was barely on the table. This was not just economically damaging, it was psychologically devastating. The whole society was telling you that your struggles did not matter as much, that your unemployment was less tragic, that your poverty was somehow less worthy of attention. You were invisible in the programs, invisible in the policies, invisible in the national conversation about recovery. And if you were a woman of colour, you were facing the double burden of both gender and racial discrimination. You were excluded from programs that white women could access. You were pushed into the worst jobs. You were paid the least. You had the fewest options. The New Deal, which did help many Americans, often left women of colour completely behind. There is this quote from a historian named Susan Ware that I think captures it perfectly. She says that the New Deal did not outwardly target women's issues, and that is the understatement of the century. The New Deal did not just fail to target women's issues, it actively structured programs in ways that excluded women and reinforce traditional gender roles. It took a crisis moment when the entire economy was being restructured and used it to double down on the idea that women belonged in the home and men belonged in the workforce. Do you know what is both ironic and tragic? While the government was designing programs around the assumption that men were breadwinners and women were dependents, the reality on the ground was exactly the opposite for millions of families. Women were the only ones with income. Women were keeping their families afloat. Women were the actual breadwinners, but the policies pretended this was not happening, or treated it as an unfortunate temporary situation that would be corrected once men could work again. The New Deal is often remembered as this great progressive triumph, and in many ways it was. It established the principle that government has a responsibility to help citizens in times of crisis. It created programs and infrastructure that benefited millions of people. But we need to be honest about who was left out, who was excluded, who was treated as less deserving of help. And single women, especially single women of colour, were absolutely left out. This matters because it set patterns that lasted for decades. The structure of Social Security still reflects those original assumptions about male breadwinners. Policies around work and family still carry echoes of the idea that women's primary role is in the home. The New Deal helped build modern America, but it built it on a foundation that assumed single women did not really need to be part of the equation. But here is the thing about single women in the 1930s, they survived anyway. Without government help, or with only the barest minimum of assistance, they figured out how to keep going. They developed survival strategies, underground economies, networks of mutual support. They did what they had to do to make it through. And that story, the story of how they actually survived despite being abandoned by the safety net, that is what we need to explore next. When the system fails you, you build your own system. That is exactly what single women did in the 1930s. Faced with inadequate wages, excluded from government programs, living in substandard housing, they created an entire underground economy of survival. Invisible networks of sharing, bartering, mutual aid, and creative resourcefulness that historians are only now beginning to fully understand. These were not official programs with government funding and organized structures. These were organic, grassroots solutions born from desperation and necessity. And they reveal something beautiful about human resilience, even as they expose the cruelty of a society that forced women into such desperate measures. Let me start with the most basic survival strategy, sharing food. And I do not mean sharing in the comfortable, let's have dinner together sense. I mean the kind of sharing where you literally cannot eat unless someone helps you. Picture a boarding house with 15 women living in separate rooms. Maybe 3 of them have steady jobs this week. 5 are working part-time or irregularly. 7 have no income at all right now. How do they all eat? They pool resources. The women with jobs buy food, maybe a loaf of bread, some apples, a bit of cheese, a can of beans. They bring it back to the boarding house and share it. Not generously, as if they have plenty to spare, but calculatedly, knowing that next week they might be the ones without income and they will need someone to share with them. It is insurance. It is community. It is survival. Some boarding houses had shared kitchens where women could cook together. You would see scenes that looked almost like a communal meal, except everyone was painfully aware of who contributed what. One woman brought potatoes, another brought an onion and a carrot. A third managed to get some chicken bones from the butcher for free and made them into broth. Together they created a pot of soup that could feed 6 or 8 people. Alone, none of them would have had a real meal. And here is what strikes me about this. There were no formal rules about sharing, no official system, just an unspoken understanding that you helped when you could, because someday you would need help too. Some women kept informal tallies in their heads. She gave me dinner twice last month, so I should help her this week. But mostly it was just people taking care of each other because nobody else was going to do it. Clothes worked the same way. We talked earlier about women sewing and making do, but there was also a robust informal economy of clothing exchange. You would outgrow a dress or get tired of it, or it would no longer fit the image you needed for work. So you would trade it to someone else for a different dress or a blouse or a pair of shoes. Sometimes money changed hands, small amounts, much less than buying new would cost. Sometimes it was pure barter. I will give you this skirt if you help me alter this coat. There were also women who had skills that became currency. Can you sew really well? You could trade sewing services for meals, for a place to stay for a few nights, for help with something else. Can you type? Maybe someone needed a letter typed for a job application and would pay you a quarter, or trade you a jar of preserves their mother sent from home. Can you cut hair? Women would trade haircuts for darning socks or mending a tear in a dress. This created what economists might call an informal gift economy, except calling it gifts misses the desperation behind it. These were not generous extras, they were survival necessities being traded because there was no other option. You gave what you could spare, which was often almost nothing, in hopes that when you had absolutely nothing, someone would do the same for you. Let me tell you about a practice that historians have documented, but that rarely makes it into history books. Light housekeeping arrangements that were actually much more exploitative than the name suggests. A landlord would advertise a room for free or very cheap, say $2 a week instead of $7, but in exchange you had to do housekeeping for the landlord. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, essentially you were working as a live-in domestic servant in exchange for a place to sleep. Now this might sound like a fair trade, but think about the power dynamics. The landlord controlled your housing. If they decided you were not cleaning well enough, you were out on the street. There were no contracts, no protections. You could be working 10 or 15 hours a week on top of your regular job just to afford a room, and the landlord could change the terms at any time. Actually, I need you to also watch my children 3 afternoons a week. What were you going to do? Refuse? Where else would you go? Some women ended up in situations that were even more precarious. They would find temporary arrangements, sleeping on someone's couch for a few weeks, or staying with a friend's family, or taking a room that was only available month to month with no guarantee of renewal. Living in constant uncertainty about where you would sleep next month becomes its own form of torture. You cannot settle, you cannot relax, you're always looking for the next temporary solution. And then there were the soup kitchens and breadlines. We tend to think of these as places for homeless men, and mostly they were. But women went too, though often they went to different locations or at different times to avoid the stigma. There were church basements that served meals to poor working girls. There were settlement houses that provided food to neighborhood residents. There were places where you could get a bowl of soup and a piece of bread for free, no questions asked, if you could swallow your pride enough to walk through the door. The psychology of accepting charity is complicated. For women who'd been raised to be self-sufficient, who had worked hard all their lives, standing in line for free food felt like admitting failure. It felt shameful. Many women avoided it until they were literally starving. And even then, they would try to go to places where they would not be recognized, where their co-workers or neighbors would not see them. There are accounts of women walking miles out of their way to go to a soup kitchen in a different neighborhood, just to preserve their dignity in their own community. Can you imagine being so hungry you need free food, but so afraid of being seen that you walk an extra 2 or 3 miles to get it? The energy you waste on that walk when you are already malnourished? But the alternative, being known as someone who needs charity, felt worse. Now let me talk about something darker, something that is hard to discuss but that we need to acknowledge. Some women survive through what we would now call sex work, or relationships that blurred the line between dating and survival. We touched on treating earlier, but there were other arrangements too. A woman might have a boyfriend who helped her with rent in exchange for companionship and sex. Neither person would call it prostitution. They were dating, as it was helping her out. But the economic transaction was clear. If she stopped seeing him, the help stopped. Or there were women who found older men, sometimes married men, who would support them financially in exchange for an ongoing affair. These arrangements were secretive and risky. If you were caught, you could lose your job, your housing, your reputation. But if you were desperate enough, the risk seemed worth it. I am not judging any of this. When you're facing homelessness or starvation, you do what you need to do to survive. But we need to be honest about the fact that poverty pushed some women into sexual relationships they might not have chosen otherwise. The line between choice and coercion gets very blurry when the alternative is sleeping on the street. There were also women who stole, small thefts usually, shoplifting food or small items they could resell, stealing from employers, taking home office supplies, or food from the kitchen where they worked as domestics, or small amounts of money from cash registers. Again, I am not condoning theft, but I am saying that when you are hungry and desperate, morality becomes a luxury you cannot afford. Most women who stole felt terrible about it. They saw themselves as good people driven to bad acts by impossible circumstances. Some promised themselves they would pay it back someday when they had money. Some justified it by saying the stores or rich people they were stealing from could afford the loss. Some just tried not to think about it too much because thinking about it meant confronting how far they had fallen from who they thought they were. And then there were the mental health costs of all this survival. Imagine living every single day not knowing if you will have enough food, not knowing if you can make rent, not knowing if your job will still exist next week. The constant stress, the constant fear, the constant calculations of how to stretch inadequate resources to cover overwhelming needs. It was exhausting, it was traumatizing. Women developed anxiety and depression at high rates, though of course nobody called it that. You were nervous or melancholy or just tired. Mental health care was essentially non-existent, especially for poor women. You dealt with it on your own. Maybe you talked to a friend, maybe you cried alone in your room, maybe you just pushed it down and kept going because you had no choice. Some women found solace in religion. Churches offered not just soup kitchens, but also community, a sense of purpose, a framework for understanding suffering. If you believed God had a plan, that suffering had meaning, it was slightly more bearable than thinking it was all random cruelty. Many churches had women's groups where you could talk about your struggles with others in similar situations. It was not therapy, but it was something. Other women found escape in entertainment. Movies were relatively cheap, 10 or 15 cents for a matinee. For that price, you could sit in a dark theatre for 2 hours and forget about your problems. You could watch beautiful people in beautiful clothes, living glamorous lives. It was fantasy, pure escapism, and it was worth every penny because it gave you a brief respite from the grinding reality of survival. Some women read voraciously, public libraries were free, and books were an escape that cost nothing. You could lose yourself in novels, imagine different lives, different worlds. Reading was both entertainment and education. Some women taught themselves new skills by reading library books, typing, stenography, bookkeeping, hoping to qualify for better jobs. And there were the women who organized. Not just the association of unemployed single women that we talked about, though they were remarkable, but also informal organizing in boarding houses, in workplaces, in neighborhoods. Women getting together to strategize about how to negotiate for better wages, or push back against unfair rules, or support each other in demanding decent treatment. These efforts rarely made the newspapers. They were not dramatic protests that got photographed. They were quiet, persistent efforts to carve out small improvements in terrible situations. a group of secretaries agreeing to all ask for raises at the same time so the boss could not single out any one of them. Women in a boarding house collectively refusing to pay rent until the landlord fixed the broken heating. Small acts of resistance that required enormous courage. Here is something important to understand. These survival strategies worked. Sort of. They kept women alive, but they also kept women trapped in poverty. When all your energy goes into just surviving day to day, you cannot plan for the future. You cannot save money. There is nothing left to save. You cannot invest in education or training that might lead to better opportunities. You are stuck in survival mode, which means you are stuck in poverty, which means you will keep needing these survival strategies indefinitely. It is a vicious cycle. Poverty creates the need for desperate measures. Desperate measures take all your time and energy. Having no time or energy makes it impossible to escape poverty, and around it goes. Some women spent the entire Depression decade in this cycle, never quite starving but never quite secure either. The resilience these women showed is genuinely awe-inspiring. They found ways to survive that nobody should have had to find. They created community where society offered none. They helped each other when the government would not help them. They adapted, they persevered, they made it through. But, and this is crucial, we should not romanticize this suffering. The fact that they survived does not mean the situation was acceptable. The fact that they found ways to cope does not excuse a society that abandoned them. Resilience in the face of injustice is admirable, but it would be far better if the injustice did not exist in the first place. These women deserved better. They deserved living wages. They deserved affordable housing. They deserved government assistance when they needed it. They deserved to not have to trade sex for rent or steal food to eat or sleep on strangers' couches. The ingenuity they showed in surviving should have been directed toward building lives, not just avoiding starvation. And we need to remember that not everyone survived. For all the women who made it through, there were others who did not. Women who died from malnutrition or untreated illnesses. Women who took their own lives out of despair. Women who simply disappeared from the historical record, lost in the cracks of a system that never saw them to begin with. We tell the stories of survivors because they are here to tell, but we must remember the ones who are not. But survival was not the only thing that was hard during these years. Because humans need more than food and shelter. They need connection, intimacy, love. And for single women in the 1930s, navigating questions of sexuality and relationships came with its own set of impossible challenges and dangerous risks. That is where our journey takes us next, into the hidden lives and private struggles that women could never speak about publicly. There are some parts of history that get whispered about rather than spoken aloud. The intimate lives of single women in the 1930s fall squarely into that category. Because here is the thing. Women in this era were supposed to be pure, chaste, saving themselves for remarriage. That was the public script, the respectable narrative. But behind closed doors, in private moments, in spaces hidden from judgmental eyes, a different reality was unfolding. Sexual attitudes were changing faster than most people wanted to admit, and single women were at the center of a quiet revolution that would not fully emerge into public consciousness for another 30 years. Let me start with a survey that shocked researchers when the results came in. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, scientists started asking women about their sexual histories. And what they discovered challenged everything society believed about female virtue. 34% of women who had come of age in the 1910s and 20s, that is, women who were now in their 20s and 30s during the Depression, reported having had sexual intercourse before marriage. 34%. Compare that to women born before 1900, where only 14% reported premarital sex. The rate had more than doubled in just one generation. Think about what that means. 1 in 3 women was doing something that society said was absolutely forbidden, shameful, ruinous, and they were doing it anyway. The so-called sexual revolution of the 1960s did not come out of nowhere. It had roots in the changing behaviors of the 1920s and 30s, but here is the crucial difference. In the 60s, people talked about it openly. In the 30s, it was happening in secret, in silence, with enormous risks for women who got caught. Because let us be very clear about what those risks were. If you became pregnant outside of marriage, your life was essentially over. You would lose your job immediately. No employer would keep an unwed pregnant woman on staff. Your boarding house would evict you. No respectable landlady wanted that kind of scandal under her roof. Your family might disown you. Your reputation would be destroyed. The father of the child had no legal obligations to you whatsoever. He could, and often did, simply walk away. So how were women having sex without constantly ending up pregnant? Contraception. But here is where it gets complicated, because birth control was in this weird legal grey area. In some states, it was outright illegal to distribute information about contraception. The federal Comstock laws from the 1870s were still technically in effect, making it illegal to send contraceptive information or devices through the mail. But by the 1930s, enforcement was spotty at best. Margaret Sanger, the famous birth control activist, had been fighting for years to make contraception legal and accessible. She opened clinics, she got arrested, she fought court battles, and by the 30s she had made real progress. There were birth control clinics in major cities where women could go, though often you had to be married or claim to be married to get help. Single women were supposed to be having sex, so why would they need birth control? But of course, single women found ways. You could buy condoms at some pharmacies, though you had to ask for them quietly, discreetly, and the pharmacist might refuse to sell them to you if you looked too young or unmarried. There were diaphragms, which required a doctor's fitting, and some doctors would help single women, while others would give you a morality lecture and send you away. There were various home remedies and folk methods of varying effectiveness and safety, and then there was withdrawal, which cost nothing and required no supplies but was notoriously unreliable. Plenty of unplanned pregnancies happened because couples relied on withdrawal and it failed. But when you have no money for contraception and no access to reliable methods, you work with what you have. Here is something that rarely gets talked about: abortion. It was illegal everywhere in the United States in the 1930s. Completely illegal. But that did not mean it did not happen. It happened all the time. Desperate women sought out illegal abortions from doctors who had risked their licenses, or from midwives who knew what they were doing, or from complete quacks who had no medical training at all. The experiences range from relatively safe procedures performed by skilled doctors in clean conditions to horrifying butchery that left women dead or permanently injured, and there was no way to know what you were getting until it was too late. You heard about someone through whispered networks. You scraped together whatever money they demanded, often a lot, because they knew you were desperate. You went to some back room or apartment, and you hoped you survived. Thousands of women died from illegal abortions during the Depression. Thousands more were left sterile or chronically ill from complications. But the deaths were rarely reported as abortion deaths. Doctors would list sepsis or hemorrhage or infection without noting the cause. Families kept the truth secret out of shame. So we will never know the true numbers, but historians estimate it was a major cause of death for young women. And if you could not afford an illegal abortion, or were too scared to try, and you ended up having a baby. There were places called maternity homes or homes for unwed mothers. These were run by churches or charitable organizations, and they were presented as places of refuge. But the reality was often more like punishment. You were sent away to have your baby in secret. Your family told neighbours you had gone to care for a sick relative or taken a job in another city. You had the baby. And then, in most cases, you were pressured or outright forced to give the baby up for adoption. The shame attached to unwed motherhood was crushing. You had failed at the most basic expectation of female morality. You had proven yourself to be loose, fallen, ruined. The maternity homes reinforced this message constantly. You were made to feel grateful for their charity while also being told you deserved your suffering. Many women who went through these homes carried trauma from the experience for the rest of their lives. But let us talk about the women who were having sex and not getting pregnant, or who were navigating relationships in other ways. Because sex was not just about reproduction, or even just about pleasure. It was about connection, intimacy, feeling less alone in a very lonely world. When you are struggling to survive, when every day is hard and uncertain, physical closeness with another person can feel like the only thing keeping you human. Young people in the 30s went to what were called petting parties. These were gatherings, usually among college students or young middle-class people, where couples would pair off and engage in sexual activity that stopped short of intercourse. Heavy kissing, touching, intimate contact, but maintaining what they considered technical virginity. In a survey of college women in the 1920s, remember these women would be in their 30s during the Depression, 92% reported having engaged in petting. 92%. So clearly the idea that young women were sitting primly with their ankles crossed waiting for marriage was fantasy. The reality was that sexual norms were changing, and young people were experimenting with physical intimacy in ways that horrified their parents' generation. And what about women who were not interested in men at all? Lesbian and bisexual women existed in the 1930s, obviously, but they had to be incredibly careful. Homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable. In many places, it was actually illegal. You could be arrested for crimes against nature or sexual perversion. You could lose your job, your housing, custody of your children if you had any. So queer women developed coded ways of finding each other. There were certain bars or clubs in big cities where women knew they could go and meet other women, though these places were constantly under threat of police raids. There were private parties in apartments, invitation only, where women could be themselves for a few hours. There were partnerships that looked like roommates sharing expenses, but were actually romantic relationships. Boarding houses and women's residential hotels sometimes became spaces where lesbian relationships could exist, hidden in plain sight. Two women sharing a room to save money? Nobody questioned that. Two women who were always together, who seemed very close? Just good friends, surely. The invisibility that made single women's struggles go unnoticed also provided a kind of cover for relationships that society refused to acknowledge. But the constant hiding took a toll. Imagine loving someone and never being able to hold their hand in public, never being able to introduce them as your partner, never being able to build a life together openly. The loneliness of that, the isolation, the constant fear of discovery, it was its way of surviving against impossible odds. There were also women who were asexual, or who simply were not interested in romantic or sexual relationships at all. But society had no framework for understanding that. If you were a woman who did not want to get married, who did not seem interested in men, people assumed something was wrong with you. You were too picky, too frigid, too masculine, too strange. The idea that you might simply be content without romance was incomprehensible to most people. Now let us talk about sexual harassment, because that was absolutely happening, but nobody called it that. Women working in offices or shops dealt constantly with unwanted advances from bosses and male co-workers. A man might corner you in the supply room and make suggestive comments. He might touch you inappropriately while walking past your desk. He might make it clear that keeping your job depended on being friendly with him. And what could you do? There were no sexual harassment laws, no human resources departments to report to. If you complained, you would be the one who got in trouble. You were told you were being too sensitive, that you should be flattered, that boys will be boys. If you refused a boss's advances, you could be fired. If you accepted them, you were considered a slut who had it coming. Some women develop strategies for deflecting unwanted attention. Always keep a desk between yourself and male co-workers. Never work late alone with a man. Dress as conservatively as possible. Never smile too much or be too friendly, because that might be misinterpreted as invitation. But these strategies only went so far. Determined predators would find ways regardless. And if you were sexually assaulted, the chances of getting justice were essentially zero. Reporting it meant having your sexual history examined, your character questioned, your clothing choices analysed. Were you really raped or did you lead him on? Were you drunk? Were you out late at night? Were you walking alone? The victim was always put on trial more than the perpetrator. Most women did not report. They told a friend maybe, or wrote about it in a diary, or just tried to forget it happened. They blame themselves. I should not have been there. I should not have worn that. I should not have trusted him. The trauma was compounded by having no outlet, no validation, no justice. Here is something else that is hard to talk about but important. Some women stayed in abusive relationships because leaving meant losing their only source of financial support. If a man was helping with your rent, even if he was also hurting you, leaving him might mean homelessness. The economic dependency created by the Depression trapped women in situations they desperately wanted to escape. And let us address the marriage question one more time from this more intimate angle. Remember, we talked about how marriage rates dropped during the Depression, but that did not mean people stopped wanting connection and partnership. It just meant they could not afford the formal institution of marriage. So some couples created what we might now call common law marriages. They lived together, they considered themselves married, but they never had a legal ceremony because they could not afford it. This created all kinds of legal complications. If the man died, the woman had no legal claim to his property or any benefits. If they had children, the children might be considered illegitimate. If they separated, the woman had no legal rights whatsoever. But when the alternative was complete loneliness, many women took that risk. There were also long engagements. Couples who were engaged for 5, 8, 10 years, waiting for economic circumstances to improve enough to actually marry. Imagine being in love with someone, committed to them, but unable to build a life together because you literally cannot afford to set up a household. That waiting, that indefinite postponement of the future you want, is its own form of suffering. And through all of this, the changing sexual norms, the hidden relationships, the constant dangers, the impossible choices, women were supposed to maintain an appearance of perfect propriety. You could be sexually active, but you had better not look like you were. You could be navigating complex, intimate relationships, but publicly you were just a nice, respectable working girl. The gap between private reality and public performance was enormous. Do you know what I find most striking about all of this? The resilience yet again. Women were navigating impossible moral and practical terrain. They were making choices with life-altering consequences while having almost no good options to choose from. They were creating intimacy and connection in a society that offered them no safe space to do so. They were surviving, and sometimes even finding joy and love, despite everything working against them. But the toll of all this secrecy, all this shame, all this constant vigilance and fear, it was profound. The anxiety of hiding who you loved, the trauma of an illegal abortion, the violation of sexual harassment you could not report, the heartbreak of a pregnancy you could not keep, the loneliness of wanting connection but being too afraid to seek it. These invisible wounds shaped women's lives in ways that often did not become apparent until decades later. The intimate lives of single women in the 1930s were far more complex, varied and messy than the prim stereotype suggests. They were human beings with human needs and desires trying to navigate those needs in a society that denied them legitimacy. And the psychological cost of living that way, of being one person in private and another in public, of constantly fearing discovery and judgment, well, that brings us to our next chapter. Because all of this pressure, all of this stress, all of these impossible expectations took a serious toll on women's mental and emotional well-being. Let us explore that landscape next. You can only carry so much weight before something breaks. For single women in the 1930s, the weight they carried was immense. Economic insecurity, social stigma, constant judgment, impossible expectations, chronic stress. And yet they were supposed to smile through it all, to appear cheerful and pleasant and well-adjusted, because nobody wanted to hire or date or rent to a woman who seemed unhappy or unstable. The psychological toll of maintaining that facade while barely surviving was staggering. And here is the tragic part. We have so few records of it because admitting to mental or emotional struggles could cost you everything you had worked so hard to protect. Let me paint you a picture of what depression looked like in 1935, though of course nobody called it depression. You are lying in your tiny room in the boarding house. It is Sunday afternoon, your only day off. You should get up. You should write letters to your family. You should mend that tear in your dress. You should look for a second job because one is not enough. But you cannot seem to move. You just lie there, staring at the ceiling, feeling this heavy emptiness that makes everything seem pointless. You're not sad exactly. You're not crying. You just feel hollow, like you're watching your own life from a distance and nothing really matters. Your landlady knocks on the door and asks if you're all right. You force yourself to say yes, everything is fine, you're just tired. Because what would happen if you said the truth? If you said, actually, I think I'm losing my grip on reality, and I do not know how much longer I can keep pretending everything is okay. They would think you were going crazy. They might ask you to leave the boarding house because you are making other residents uncomfortable. Your employer might find out and decide you are not stable enough for your job. So you say you are fine, you get up, you paste on a smile, and you keep going even though you feel like you are drowning. This was the reality for countless women. What we would now recognize as clinical depression or anxiety disorders went completely undiagnosed and untreated. Mental health care in the 1930s was primitive at best and actively harmful at worst. If you were wealthy and your family wanted to do something about your mental health problems, you might be sent to a sanitarium for rest. But if you were a working-class single woman barely making rent, there was no help for you, you just had to cope. And the pressure to cope, to appear normal, to maintain the appearance of being a pleasant, well-adjusted woman, that pressure made everything worse. Because you could not even acknowledge your struggle without risking everything. You had to suffer in silence, alone, in your tiny room, with no one to tell and nowhere to turn. Let me talk about loneliness for a moment, because this was perhaps the most pervasive form of suffering. Imagine being in a city of millions of people and feeling completely alone. You go to work every day, surrounded by co-workers, but you cannot really connect with them because you're all competing for the same scarce resources. You live in a boarding house with 15 other women, but everyone is so preoccupied with their own survival that there is little energy left for genuine friendship. Your family is maybe hundreds of miles away, if you even have family. You write letters, but letters take days to arrive and they cannot capture the daily grinding loneliness of eating dinner alone in your room because you cannot afford to go out, of having no one to talk to about your fears and hopes, of feeling like you are invisible to the world even though you are surrounded by people constantly. Some women formed deep friendships in boarding houses or at work, and these friendships became lifelines. Having one person who really saw you, who knew your struggles and did not judge you, who would sit with you when you were low and celebrate with you when something good happened. That could make the difference between surviving and falling apart. But finding that kind of friendship required vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous when everyone was so precarious. There were also women who found community through churches or social organizations. The Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, ran programs in many cities specifically for working women. They offered classes, social events, sometimes cheap meals or temporary housing. For some women, these became crucial sources of connection and support. You could go to a YWCA event and be surrounded by other women in similar situations, women who understood what you were going through without you having to explain. Settlement houses in immigrant neighborhoods served similar functions. They were community centers that offered everything from English classes to social events to childcare. For immigrant single women, who often faced additional barriers of language and cultural isolation, settlement houses could be the only place they felt they belonged. But here is something darker we need to acknowledge. Some women did not make it. We have fragmentary evidence of suicide among single women during the Depression, though the true numbers will never be known because many deaths were not reported accurately. A woman found dead might be listed as accidental overdose or fell from window when the reality was suicide. Families kept it quiet because of the shame. Society did not want to acknowledge that people were literally dying from despair. And for every woman who took her own life, there were probably dozens or hundreds who thought about it, who stood on the edge, metaphorically or literally, and somehow found a reason to step back. Maybe it was a small kindness from a stranger. Maybe it was a letter from home. Maybe it was just stubborn refusal to give up. But the fact that so many women were that close to the edge tells you how severe the psychological crisis really was. Let me talk about what we might now call anxiety, though again that was not the term used then. You were nervous or high-strung, or you had bad nerves. This manifested in constant worry about money, about your job, about your housing, about your health. Every expense was a source of stress. Getting sick meant potentially losing your job, which meant losing your housing, which meant destitution. So every cough, every headache, every sign of illness triggered this cascade of panic about worst-case scenarios. And the worry was not irrational. Bad things really were one small misfortune away. You really could lose everything because of one illness, or one lost job, or one vindictive boss. So the anxiety was actually a realistic response to genuinely precarious circumstances. But that did not make it any easier to live with. The constant state of alertness, the inability to relax, the physical symptoms, headaches, stomach problems, insomnia, muscle tension, all took a toll. Sleep problems were endemic. How do you sleep soundly when you're worried about making rent? When you're cold because the boarding house heat is inadequate? When you are hungry? When you can hear every sound through the thin walls? When you're lying in bed alone cataloguing everything that could go wrong? Chronic sleep deprivation made everything else worse. It made you less effective at work, more emotionally fragile, more susceptible to illness. Some women self-medicated. Alcohol was legal again after Prohibition ended in 1933, and it was relatively cheap. A drink could take the edge off the anxiety, could help you fall asleep, could make you feel briefly less miserable. But of course, a woman drinking alone was considered highly improper. So if you drank, you had to hide it, which added another layer of shame and secrecy to your coping mechanisms. There were also patent medicines and tonics that contained alcohol, opium derivatives, or other drugs. These were sold as cures for female complaints or nervous exhaustion. Some women used them heavily, probably developing dependencies, though addiction was not well understood and certainly was not treated. Now let me tell you about something that gives me hope amidst all this darkness. The resilient strategies that actually worked. Some women kept diaries or journals, writing out their feelings and fears in private. This gave them an outlet for emotions they could not express publicly. Reading these surviving diaries now is both heartbreaking and inspiring. You see women processing their struggles, finding meaning in small moments, refusing to give up even when everything seems hopeless. Letter writing served a similar purpose. Women would write long letters to family or friends, pouring out their hearts. The act of articulating their experiences, even if they could not mail every letter they wrote, helped them process their emotions. And receiving letters in return, knowing that someone somewhere cared about them, provided vital, emotional sustenance. Some women found purpose through volunteering or activism. Even when you are struggling yourself, helping others can give you a sense of meaning and connection. Women volunteered at soup kitchens, helped neighbours who were worse off, got involved in labour organising or political movements. Having a cause beyond your own survival made the struggle feel more bearable. And there were women who found solace in creative expression, writing poetry or stories, drawing, playing music, singing. These activities cost little or nothing, but provided an outlet for emotions that had nowhere else to go. Some boarding houses had pianos in the common rooms, and women would gather to sing together. That communal music-making was a form of therapy, though nobody called it that. Physical activity helped too. Walking was free, and some women walked for miles just to clear their heads. Exercise released tension and gave you time to think. In cities, you could walk through parks or along waterfronts. Some women joined informal sports clubs, basketball teams, or swimming groups that provided both exercise and social connection. But here is what I want you to understand. All of these coping strategies, all of this resilience, all of this finding ways to keep going, it should not have been necessary. These women should not have had to work so hard just to maintain their mental health in the face of systemic abandonment. The fact that they did it is admirable, but the fact that they had to do it is tragic. And there is one more category of psychological burden we need to discuss. The internalized shame of not meeting societal expectations. Society told you that being single past a certain age meant you had failed, that needing help meant you were weak, that if you were struggling, it was your own fault for not being resourceful enough, pretty enough, pleasant enough, smart enough. That narrative got inside women's heads and became a voice of constant self-criticism. Women blamed themselves for circumstances that were not their fault. If I were just more attractive, I would have found a husband and would not be in this situation. If I were smarter, I would have a better job. If I were not so difficult, my boss would not have fired me. None of this was true. They were victims of economic catastrophe and systemic discrimination. But the societal messages were so strong that women internalized them. Breaking free from that internalized shame required seeing that the system was broken, not you. And some women did achieve that clarity. They recognized that they were working as hard as they possibly could, that their struggles were not personal failures but structural injustices. This political consciousness was liberating, even if it did not immediately change their material circumstances. Understanding that you are being oppressed by an unjust system is less psychologically damaging than believing you are just inherently inadequate. There were also moments of unexpected joy that kept women going. A beautiful sunset, a kind word from a stranger, finding a dollar bill on the sidewalk, getting a compliment on a dress you made yourself. Small pleasures took on enormous significance when your life was otherwise so hard. women learned to savor these moments, to hold on to them as evidence that life still had good things in it. And friendship, real deep friendship, was perhaps the most powerful resilience factor. When you found someone who truly knew you and accepted you, someone you could be honest with about your struggles, someone who would support you without judgment, that relationship could sustain you through almost anything. Women created chosen families with friends when their biological families were distant or unhelpful. I think about these women lying in their narrow beds at night, exhausted from the day's work and worry, and somehow finding the strength to get up and do it all again the next day. Where did that strength come from? Partly from necessity, what was the alternative? But also from something deeper, a refusal to be defeated, a stubborn hope that things might get better, a sense that their lives mattered, even if society treated them as if they did not. The psychological landscape of single women in the 1930s was one of constant pressure, limited support, and remarkable resilience. They faced mental health challenges that would be difficult even with modern resources and support systems. They faced them with essentially nothing, and most of them survived. That alone is extraordinary, but surviving came at a cost. The coping mechanisms they developed, the emotional armor they built, the vulnerability they learned to hide, the expectations they learned to lower, shaped who they became for the rest of their lives. Some women emerged from the Depression years with their spirits intact, even strengthened. Others carried invisible scars that never fully healed. And here is something crucial to remember as we near the end of our journey together. These women did not just survive, many of them went on to do remarkable things. The skills they developed during the Depression, the resilience, the resourcefulness, the determination, served them well in the decades that followed. When World War II came and created new opportunities, many of these women were ready. They had already proven they could handle anything. So as we move toward our final chapter, I want you to think about legacy. What did these women leave behind? What did they teach us? How did their struggles and their strength shape the America that came after them? Because their story does not end with the Depression. It reverberates through the decades that followed, influencing the fight for women's rights, changing the possibilities available to future generations, and teaching us lessons we desperately need to remember today. We need to talk about something that has been hovering at the edges of this story all along, something I have touched on but that deserves its own full examination. Because everything we have discussed so far, the employment struggles, the housing crisis, the dating difficulties, the government abandonment, all of that was exponentially worse if you were not white. For black women, for Mexican American women, for Asian American women, for recent immigrants, the experience of being a single woman during the Depression was not just difficult. It was a fight for survival on multiple fronts simultaneously, battling both gender discrimination and racial oppression in a society that considered you barely human. Let me give you a statistic that should make your blood boil. 1/5 of all Americans receiving federal relief during the Great Depression were black. 1/5. And yet farm workers and domestic workers, the two categories where you found the vast majority of black women, were explicitly excluded from the Social Security Act of 1935. Read that again. The jobs that black women did were carved out of Social Security protection. You could work your entire life as a domestic servant, which was backbreaking, exhausting labor, and you would have nothing. No pension, no safety net, nothing. Why were these jobs excluded? The official excuse was that they were too difficult to administer, that tracking farm and domestic workers would be too complicated. But historians have shown pretty conclusively that the real reason was racism. Southern Democrats in Congress insisted on excluding these categories because they wanted to maintain control over black workers, especially in the South. If black women had Social Security, They would have a tiny bit of independence, a tiny bit of security that did not depend on white employers, and that was unacceptable to the power structure. So here is what this meant in practice. Imagine you are a black woman in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1936, you work as a domestic servant in a white family's home. You cook their meals, clean their house, wash their clothes by hand, take care of their children. You work 6 days a week, often 10 or 12 hours a day, and you earn maybe $5 or $6 a week, maybe less. The white families you work for have suffered financially from the Depression too, and they know you have no other options, so they can pay you almost nothing and you have to accept it. There is no legal minimum wage for domestic work, no maximum hours, no overtime pay, no sick leave, no vacation. If you get sick and cannot work, you do not get paid. If your employer decides they cannot afford you this week, you are out of work with no notice and no recourse. If your employer decides to cut your pay in half, what are you going to do about it? Nothing. You have no power, no protection, no alternatives. And if you complain, if you push back, there are 100 other black women who need work desperately and will accept even worse conditions than you are enduring. Your employer knows this. You know this. So you say nothing, you accept the exploitation, and you try to survive, but it gets worse. During the Depression, there was a phenomenon that historians have documented where white workers who lost their jobs in factories or offices would take over positions that had previously been held by black workers. Jobs that white people had considered beneath them before the Depression, jobs in service industries, jobs that paid very little, suddenly became acceptable when there was nothing else available. So black workers who already had the worst jobs got pushed out of even those positions, and when black women managed to find work outside of domestic service, they faced discrimination at every turn. If a factory or shop hired black women at all, they were paid less than white women doing the exact same work. They were assigned to the worst positions, the dirtiest jobs, the most dangerous tasks. They were the first fired when business slowed down and the last hired when it picked up again. Let me tell you about the experience of trying to find housing as a black single woman in the 1930s. The boarding houses and residential hotels we talked about earlier. Most of them did not accept black tenants. Signs would literally say no coloured or whites only. In some cities there were specific neighbourhoods where black people were allowed to live and everywhere else was off limits. This was not just social custom, it was often enforced by law through racial covenants written into property deeds. So black women had far fewer housing options, which meant they paid more for worse conditions. A black woman might pay the same rent as a white woman for a room that was smaller, in worse repair, in a more dangerous neighbourhood with fewer amenities. And landlords knew they could get away with this because black tenants had nowhere else to go. The same dynamics applied to Mexican American women, especially in the Southwest and California, but they faced an additional horror: deportation. In the 1930s, the government conducted mass deportations of people of Mexican descent. And here is the truly evil part. Many of the people deported were actually American citizens born in the United States. But if you looked Mexican, if you had a Spanish surname, you could be swept up in raids and forced onto trains or buses heading to Mexico, whether you had ever been there before or not. Approximately 400,000 people of Mexican descent left, or were forced out of the United States during the Depression. Families were torn apart. American citizens lost their homes, their jobs, their entire lives because of their ethnicity. And Mexican American women working in agriculture or domestic service were particularly vulnerable. They had no legal protection, no documentation that would prove their citizenship in many cases, no resources to fight back. Chinese and Japanese women faced similar discrimination, though in smaller numbers because racist immigration laws had already severely limited Asian immigration by the 1930s. The few Asian American women who were trying to make it as single workers faced not just job discrimination, but also laws that restricted what kind of work they could do and where they could live. And Jewish women, many of whom were recent immigrants or daughters of immigrants, faced anti-Semitism that limited their opportunities. Certain industries, certain companies, certain neighborhoods were closed to Jews. Want ads would sometimes explicitly state Christians only. Some boarding houses would not rent to Jewish women. The discrimination was pervasive. Now let me talk about what happened when black women tried to access New Deal programs. Remember the Works Progress Administration that employed millions of Americans? The programs were administered locally, which meant that southern states and cities could discriminate with impunity. Black women who applied for WPA jobs were often turned away entirely, or they were assigned to the worst positions with the lowest pay. When black women did get government work, it was overwhelmingly as housekeeping aides. The federal government was literally paying black women to work as servants in white people's homes. The program reinforced exactly the racial hierarchy it should have been challenging. And the housekeeping aide positions paid less than other WPA jobs, of course. Even in government programs supposedly designed to help everyone, black women were segregated into the worst positions. There was one bright spot worth mentioning. Mary McLeod Bethune, an extraordinary black educator and activist, became an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt and led what was called the Black Cabinet, a group of black advisors within New Deal agencies. Because of Bethune's tireless advocacy, nearly every New Deal agency eventually had a black advisor. The number of African Americans working in government jobs tripled during the New Deal. But let us be honest about the scale. Tripling a very small number still gives you a small number. And while having black voices in government was important symbolically, and did lead to some material improvements, it could not undo the structural racism baked into the New Deal programs. Bethune fought hard and achieved real things, but she was fighting against a tidal wave of discrimination. Here is something that really illuminates the double burden of race and gender. Black women were often the sole breadwinners for their families at higher rates than white women, because black men faced even more severe employment discrimination and violence. So black women were supporting parents, siblings, children, sometimes extended family members, all on wages that were a fraction of what white women earned, which were already a fraction of what white men earned. Can you imagine that math? You're earning maybe $5 a week. You need to pay for your room, your food, your clothes, your transportation to work. And you're also sending money home to your mother or supporting your children, or helping your sister who just lost her job. How do you make $5 stretch that far? You do not. You go without. You skip meals. You wear clothes until they are literally falling apart. You walk miles to save streetcar fare. You live in a constant state of deprivation that goes beyond what most white women experienced. And the emotional toll of this was crushing. You are working as hard as you possibly can, doing backbreaking labor, and you're still barely surviving. You see white women who complain about their situations, and yes, their situations are hard, but they have options you will never have. They can walk into places you are not allowed to enter. They can apply for jobs that will not even consider you. Their poverty is temporary for many of them. Yours feels permanent. The resilience required to keep going under these circumstances is almost superhuman. And black women did keep going. They created their own support networks, their own institutions. Black churches were not just spiritual centers, but social service organizations, providing food assistance, job networks, childcare, everything the government would not provide. Black women's clubs and organizations created scholarships, ran community programs, fought for civil rights. Let me tell you about something beautiful and heartbreaking. The tradition of black women taking in boarders or keeping roomers in their own homes. Even when they were barely getting by themselves, black women would rent out a room or a corner of their home to other black women who needed a place to stay. This created community and brought in a tiny bit of extra income. But it also meant living in even more crowded, difficult conditions. And immigrant women from all backgrounds developed similar strategies. Italian women, Polish women, Greek women, Jewish women. They created ethnic enclaves where they could support each other, share resources, maintain cultural traditions that gave them a sense of identity and belonging in a hostile country. These communities were survival mechanisms, but here is what I want you to understand. While these community support systems were vital and beautiful, they were also born from exclusion. Black women supported each other because white institutions would not support them. Immigrant women created their own networks because they were shut out of mainstream opportunities. The strength of these communities is admirable, but it should not have been necessary. Think about the intersections of identity these women were navigating. If you were a black single woman, you faced discrimination for being black, for being a woman, and for being unmarried. 3 strikes against you in a society that valued white, male, married as the ideal. If you were a Mexican-American single mother, add another layer of stigma and difficulty. If you were a Chinese woman who did not speak English fluently, another barrier. Every additional marginalized identity multiplied the challenges exponentially, and yet women with all of these intersecting oppressions still survived, still built lives, still found moments of joy and connection and meaning. The strength that required is staggering. There is another aspect of this we need to address: colorism within communities of color. Light-skinned black women sometimes had access to opportunities that dark-skinned black women did not. This created painful divisions within black communities. Similarly, immigrant women who spoke English without an accent, or who could pass as native-born Americans, had advantages that more recent immigrants did not. These divisions were not the fault of women trying to survive. They were the result of a white supremacist system that rewarded proximity to whiteness. But they created additional layers of complexity and pain. You might face discrimination from both white society and from your own community if you did not fit the acceptable mold. And let us talk about the specific dangers that women of color faced. Sexual violence against black women and immigrant women by the white men was rampant and went almost entirely unpunished. A black woman working as a domestic servant was vulnerable to assault by male members of the household. If she reported it, she would not be believed. She would be fired. She might be arrested for making false accusations. So most women suffered in silence, carrying trauma that had no outlet and no justice. The same was true for immigrant women, especially those who did not speak English well or who were undocumented. They could be exploited and abused with impunity because they had no recourse, no protection, no voice that anyone would listen to. I want to share one more thing that I think captures the full scope of this injustice. There were black women and immigrant women during the Depression who were every bit as talented, intelligent and capable as anyone else. Women who could have been doctors, lawyers, teachers, scientists, leaders, but the society they lived in would not let them. Their potential was wasted. Their gifts were squandered because of racism and xenophobia and misogyny. Think about what America lost because of this. Think about the contributions these women could have made if they had been given opportunities equal to their abilities. The inventions that were never created, the books that were never written, the leadership that was never exercised. The injustice is not just about the suffering these women endured, though that alone is horrific. It is also about the collective loss, the waste of human potential on a massive scale. As we move toward our final chapter, I want you to hold all of these stories in your mind. The white single woman struggling to make rent, and the black single woman earning half as much for twice the work. The native-born woman facing discrimination for being unmarried, and the immigrant woman facing discrimination for her accent and her name. All of these women with different challenges and different resources, all trying to survive the same economic catastrophe in a society that valued none of them as they deserved. Their stories together tell us something crucial about how systems of oppression work, how they intersect, how they compound. And they tell us something equally important about resistance, resilience, and the power of community in the face of injustice. As we bring this long journey to a close, we need to ask ourselves, what did these women teach us? What do their struggles and their strength mean for us today? What legacy did they leave, and how should we honour it? Let us explore that together in our final chapter. We have come a long way together tonight, through boarding house rooms and soup kitchen lines, through government offices that turned women away and private moments of desperation and hope. We have walked alongside women whose names we will never know, women who lived and struggled and survived in ways that history almost forgot to record. And now, as we reach the end of this journey, I want us to think about what it all means. Not just what happened back then, but what these women's lives teach us right now, today, in 2025. Because their story is not just history, it is a mirror, a warning, and a source of strength all at once. Let me start with something remarkable that historians discovered when they studied the women who came of age during the Depression. These women, the ones who were forced into the workforce in the early 1930s because of economic necessity, they had significantly higher employment rates for the rest of their lives. We are talking about differences of up to 3 percentage points compared to women who came of age in more prosperous times. That might not sound like much, but it is statistically significant, and it tells us something important. The experience of being forced to work, to be independent, to survive on your own, it changed these women permanently. They learned they could do things society said they could not do. They learned they did not need a man to survive, even if society kept insisting they did. They learned their own strength. And once you learn that about yourself, you do not forget it. When World War II came in the early 1940s and suddenly the country desperately needed women workers because all the men were going off to fight, who was ready to fill those jobs? The women who'd been working all through the Depression, the women who knew how to operate in the workforce, who had already proven they could handle difficult conditions, who had skills and experience. Rosie the Riveter did not just appear out of nowhere in 1942, she was built on the foundation laid by Depression-era working women. Think about that iconic image of Rosie with her flexed bicep and her "we can do it" attitude. That confidence, that capability, that refusal to accept limitations, those women in the 1930s already had all of that. They'd been doing it for years without the recognition, without the propaganda posters celebrating them, without the national support, and when the war created opportunities, they were ready. But here is something bittersweet. After the war ended, society expected women to go back home, to give up their jobs to returning soldiers, to return to being housewives and mothers. And many of the women who had worked through the Depression and then through the war resented this enormously. They had proven themselves. They'd supported themselves and often their families. They'd done every job men did and done it well. And now they were being told to forget all of that and bake cookies. Some did go back to domestic life, some were happy to do so. Working had been survival, not choice, and they were glad to have the option to stop. But others kept working or tried to or fought for the right to work. And the tension between women who wanted to work and a society that wanted them home shaped the 1950s in ways we are still unpacking. The women who had been single and independent during the Depression often married later than previous generations, if they married at all. Some had learned to value their independence too much to give it up. Some had seen what happened to women who depended entirely on men and decided that was too risky. Some had found fulfillment in work or friendships or lives that did not center on marriage and family. They became what we might now call career women, though that term did not really exist yet, and many of them raised daughters with different expectations than they had grown up with. They told their daughters, get an education, learn skills, be able to support yourself, do not ever be completely dependent on a man. These lessons, learned through hard experience during the Depression, got passed down to the next generation and helped fuel the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 70s. So when we see women in the 60s demanding equal pay, fighting for reproductive rights, insisting on economic independence, those demands are rooted in the experiences of Depression-era women. The connection is direct. History is not separate chapters. It is a continuous story where each generation builds on what came before. Now let me talk about the lessons we need to learn from these women's experiences, the lessons we desperately need to remember right now. First and most obviously, social safety nets need to include everyone. The New Deal's failure to protect single women, especially single women of colour, was not just a historical injustice. It set patterns that persist today. When we design programs for families and forget about people who do not fit the traditional family model, we are making the same mistake. Look at modern American social policy. How much of it still assumes a two-parent household with one primary breadwinner? How much of it still leaves out gig workers, domestic workers, freelancers, the modern equivalent of those Depression-era women working irregular jobs with no protection? We like to think we have moved past those old assumptions, but have we really? Second lesson: appearance requirements and beauty standards are not trivial. They are economic issues. Remember how Depression-era women had to spend money they desperately needed on makeup and clothing because looking presentable was a job requirement? That still happens. Women today spend significantly more on appearance than men do, and it is still tied to employment. If you show up to an interview without makeup or in wrinkled clothes, you are less likely to be hired. The standards have changed, but the underlying dynamic has not. Third lesson: housing insecurity destroys lives. The boarding house crisis, the unsafe conditions, the exploitative landlords, none of that was inevitable. It was the result of policy choices that valued property rights over human dignity. Today, we have a housing crisis again, with people in major cities unable to afford rent, living in situations that are precarious or dangerous or both. Different details, same fundamental problem, treating housing as a commodity rather than a human right. Fourth lesson: when government abandons people, they create their own support systems, but they should not have to. The mutual aid networks, the sharing economies, the community support that Depression-era women built, all of that was admirable and necessary. But it was also inadequate. Private charity and community support cannot replace systemic solutions. They can supplement, they can fill gaps, but they cannot be the whole answer. We see this today with crowdfunding for medical expenses. Yes, it is beautiful when communities come together to help someone afford cancer treatment, but the fact that we need to crowdfund for healthcare is obscene. Just like it was obscene that women in the 30s had to rely on friends sharing food because there was no adequate government assistance. Fifth lesson: intersectionality matters. You cannot address women's issues without addressing racism. You cannot address economic inequality without addressing both gender and race and immigration status. The experience of white single women in the Depression was difficult. The experience of black single women was catastrophically worse. Any solution that does not account for these differences will fail the people who need help most. And we are still making this mistake. When we talk about the gender wage gap, we often talk about women as a monolith. But the wage gap for black women is much larger than for white women. The wage gap for Latina women is even larger. If we design solutions only for the average woman, We leave the most marginalized women behind. Again. Sixth lesson: mental health support is not a luxury. The psychological toll of poverty, insecurity, and constant stress is real and devastating. Depression-era women had essentially no mental health resources, and we saw what that cost. Today we have better understanding of mental health, but access to care is still tied to money and insurance and class status. The people who need mental health support most, people in poverty, people facing discrimination, people in crisis, are the least likely to get it, just like in the 1930s. Now let me talk about what inspires me most about these women's stories. It is not just that they survived, though that alone is remarkable. It is that they maintained their humanity. They helped each other. They found joy in small things. They kept hoping for better futures. They refused to become the broken, bitter people that circumstances seemed designed to create. They made dresses from flour sacks and wore them with pride. They put on lipstick when they could barely afford food because maintaining dignity mattered. They wrote letters to family even when they had almost nothing good to report because connection mattered. They kept going to movies even though it meant skipping a meal because beauty and story and escape mattered. They lived full, complex, emotional lives despite everything trying to reduce them to mere survival. And they were not victims, even though victimization happened to them constantly. They were agents of their own lives, making choices within impossible constraints, creating meaning out of hardship, resisting in small and large ways. Some resistance was political, organizing, protesting, demanding change. Some was personal, refusing to be ashamed, maintaining self-respect, surviving with grace. All of it mattered. I think about a woman in a boarding house in 1935, exhausted from work, worried about rent, lonely and scared, sitting down to write in her diary about her day. She describes the small kindness a coworker showed her. She mentions a funny thing that happened on the streetcar. She writes about her hopes that things will get better soon. And then she goes to sleep, and the next morning she gets up and does it all again. That woman, whose name we do not know, who left no mark on history that anyone noticed, she was a hero. Not because she did anything dramatic or publicly recognized, but because she kept her humanity intact in circumstances designed to strip it away. Because she found ways to matter in a world that treated her as if she did not. Because she survived, and in surviving, she paved the way for other women to do more than survive. Every woman today who lives independently, who supports herself, who makes her own choices about work and relationships and life, she is standing on the shoulders of those Depression-era women who proved it could be done. They showed that women do not need men to survive, even though society punished them for proving it. They showed that women can work any job, endure any hardship, solve any problem if given the chance. They showed that resilience and strength are not masculine qualities. They are human qualities. And the women of colours who survived even worse circumstances, who faced multiple systems of oppression simultaneously and still built lives and communities and futures, they showed us what true strength looks like. They showed us that justice delayed is not justice denied if you keep fighting for it. They laid groundwork for civil rights movements that would not fully emerge for decades. Every social justice movement in America since the 1930s owes something to the women who survived that decade. The women's movement, the civil rights movement, the labor movement, LGBTQ rights. All of these fights were shaped by people who learned from Depression-era struggles that systems can change, that resistance matters, that solidarity is survival. So what do we owe these women? We owe them memory. We owe them recognition for struggles that were ignored in their own time. We owe them justice, not for them, because it is too late, but for the women facing similar struggles today. We owe them the commitment to build a society that does not abandon its most vulnerable people, that does not force anyone to survive on flour sack dresses and shared apples and hope. We owe them the promise to do better, to create safety nets that actually catch everyone, to address intersecting systems of oppression, to value all forms of work and all forms of family, to support mental health and physical health and housing security as basic rights, not privileges, to remember that behind every statistic is a person, and every person deserves dignity. As I think about these women tonight, I am filled with a complicated mix of emotions: anger at the injustice they faced, sorrow for the suffering that was preventable, awe at the strength they showed, gratitude for the foundation they built, and determination to honor their legacy by learning from their experiences. Their story is not a feel-good tale where everything works out in the end. Some of these women never escaped poverty. Some died young from preventable causes. Some never recovered from the trauma. The injustice they faced was real and the consequences were serious. We should not sugarcoat that. But their story is also one of profound human resilience and dignity. They showed us what it means to keep going when giving up would be easier. They showed us how to maintain hope in hopeless circumstances. They showed us how to support each other when institutions fail us. They showed us how to be fully human even when treated as less than human. And perhaps most importantly, they showed us that change is possible. The world these women lived in is not the world we live in now. Things are far from perfect today, but women have more rights, more opportunities, more protections than they did in the 1930s. That change did not happen by accident. It happened because people fought for it, because lessons were learned, because enough people decided that the status quo was unacceptable. So as we close this chapter of our journey together, I want you to carry these women with you. When you face your own struggles, remember theirs were worse, and they survived. When you see injustice, remember that silence maintains it and resistance changes it. When you feel invisible or marginalized, remember that you are part of a long line of people who refuse to disappear. And I want you to think about the women around you right now who might be struggling in ways you do not see. The single mother working 2 jobs, the immigrant woman facing discrimination, the woman in your office who always looks put together but is barely making rent, the friend who seems fine but is drowning in stress and anxiety. These are the spiritual descendants of those 1930s single women, and they need the same things those women needed: economic security, social support, recognition of their struggles, and a society that values them. You know, when I started researching this topic, I thought I was going to tell a story about the past, and I did. But what I discovered is that this is also a story about the present. The patterns repeat. The struggles continue in different forms. The lessons remain urgent and relevant. We live in a time of rising inequality, housing crises in major cities, gig economy workers with no protections, social safety nets that leave too many people behind, and political debates about who deserves help and who does not. Sound familiar? We are not in a depression, not yet anyway. But the underlying dynamics that made the 1930s so brutal for single women are still with us. So we have a choice. We can learn from history and build something better, or we can repeat the same mistakes and watch new generations suffer the same injustices. I know which I choose. I hope you do too. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these women, for thinking about what their experiences mean. I know this has been a long one. We have spent hours together exploring this forgotten chapter of history. But these stories deserved the time. These women deserve to be remembered fully, not reduced to a paragraph in a textbook. If you found this story meaningful, if it taught you something or moved you or made you think differently, I hope you will share it. Tell someone else about these remarkable women. Keep their memory alive, and more importantly, Let their lessons guide how we treat the vulnerable people in our own time. I will be back soon with another story, another journey into history's hidden corners, because there are so many more stories that need to be told, so many more voices that deserve to be heard. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Remember that survival is resistance, that dignity is power, and that every person's story matters, even if history tried to forget it. Good night, and thank you for being here.